Hey guys, tonight we are going to drift back to a time and place that's often draped in adventure and romance. But we're going to peel back that curtain. We're heading to the Golden Age of Piracy. But not to the quarterdeck of a grand ship flying the Jolly Roger. No, we're going ashore, to one of those infamous, lawless pirate havens in the Caribbean. And let's be honest, if you were actually dropped there, your chances of a peaceful night's sleep would be slim. This journey is about the people history books often forget. The ones who lived in the grit and grime behind the swashbuckling myths. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments below, let me know what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see where we're all drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice isn't the sight, but the feeling. A heavy, wet heat that settles on your skin like a damp blanket you can't throw off. It clings to you, making the cheap, rough-spun fabric of your dress stick to your back and the backs of your knees. You're standing on sand. But it's not the pristine, white powder storybooks. It's coarse, yellow-grey, and littered with dark, slimy ribbons of seaweed and the splintered remains of a wooden crate. The air itself tastes of salt and something else. Something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. You take a hesitant step forward, the unfamiliar ground shifting under your worn-out shoes. The rhythmic crash of waves on the shore is a constant, a sound that has been the backdrop to your life for weeks, maybe months. The voyage is a blur, a chaotic collage of rocking darkness, stale water, and the gruff, unintelligible shouts of men. You don't try to remember the details. It's better not to. The choice to be here was never really yours, more like the inevitable result of a series of doors slamming shut behind you, leaving only this one, grimly ajar. You look up and down the coastline. To your left, the turquoise water of the Caribbean laps against the hull of a half-sunken sloop, its mast tilted at a sad, defeated angle. To your right, the beach curves away into a dense wall of green. Palm trees, yes, but tangled with thick, unfamiliar vines and broadleaf plants that seem to press in on the narrow strip of sand, as if trying to reclaim it. The sun is relentless, beating down from a hazy, white sky. You can feel the heat radiating from the sand, even through the thin soles of your shoes. This is a pirate port, a haven for the dregs of the world, the Golden Age of Piracy, from around the 1650s to the 1730s. Created these strange, liminal spaces, places like Port Royal in Jamaica before the earthquake, or Nassau on New Providence Island. They were not colonies in the traditional sense. They were outposts of chaos, governed by no king or country, only by the sudden whims of men with pistols in their belts and stolen gold in their pockets. Here, you are beyond the reach of any law you might have once known. That thought is both terrifying and, in a strange way, completely hollow. Law had never done much for you anyway. Hey man, the one who brought you ashore in a small, leaky rowboat, grunts and gestures with his chin towards a muddy track leading away from the beach. He doesn't speak to you, just that you follow, because there is nothing else to do. The path immediately leaves the sand and plunges into the sweltering humidity of the jungle's edge. The air becomes thick, soapy, buzzing with insects you can't see. The smell changes, too. The clean salt scent is overpowered by the loamy, damp smell of earth and decaying leaves. And something else, a sharp, almost chemical tang. It's the smell of tar, used to waterproof everything from ship hulls to rope. It's a smell that, you will soon learn, permeates everything in this town. Historians and archaeologists can tell us a lot about the diet and weapons of pirates. But one of the hardest things to reconstruct is the sensory world, especially the smell of a place like this. It would have been an overwhelming stew of odors: hot tar, animal hides, rotting food waste tossed out of back doors, stagnant water, and the ever-present, cloying smell of unwashed bodies, cheap rum, and tobacco smoke. It's a smell of life lived on the very edge, with no thought for sanitation or tomorrow. You trudge along the path, your ankles already flecked with mud. You can hear the settlement before you see it. A low, constant drum of activity that grows louder with every step. It's a cacophony of shouting, the clang of a hammer on an anvil, and the faint, discordant notes of a badly played fiddle. How did you get here? The question echoes in your mind. But the answer is a fog. For women like you, the paths to these ports were many, and all of them grim. Historians still piece together the puzzle from shipping manifests, court records, and desperate letters, debating the exact circumstances. Were most women outright captives, snatched from raided coastal towns? Were they indentured servants whose contracts were sold to a tavern keeper? Or were they runaways, fleeing poverty, prison, or abuse, who simply traded one kind of cage for a smaller, more dangerous one? The official records are often maddeningly silent on the why. Listing a name and nothing more. Your story, like so many others, is already becoming a ghost. The path widens, and through the trees, you see the first of the buildings. They are not grand colonial structures. They are rough, wooden shacks, some leaning against each other for support, their timbers bleached grey by the sun and salt. A pig trots casually across your path, snuffling in the mud. You have arrived. This is your new home. A strange shore, empty. The muddy track spills out into what could generously be called a street. It's a wide, churned-up river of mud, bookmarked with stagnant puddles that reflect the harsh white sky. The buildings are a chaotic jumble of raw timber, driftwood, and salvaged ship parts. You see the curve of a ship's hull forming the wall of one shack, and a tattered piece of sailcloth stretched over another to serve as a makeshift roof. There is no plan here, no order. It's as if the town simply erupted from the ground, a fungus of desperation and opportunity. The air of this free port is thick with noise. A blacksmith's hammer rings out, a relentless, angry rhythm. Somewhere, a man laughs, a harsh, barking sound that's more threat than humor. Men are everywhere. They lean in doorways, sit on barrels, and stumble through the mud, their gaits unsteady. They are a motley collection from every corner of the Atlantic world. Sun-scorched Englishmen with faded tattoos, lean Frenchmen with weary eyes, towering Africans whose presence speaks of a history you can only guess at, and Spaniards whose allegiance might shift with the tide. Their clothes are a mismatched mess of sailors' slops, stolen finery, and practical leather. Almost every man has a weapon, a cutlass strapped to his hip, a brace of pistols tucked into his sash, a long knife in his boot. The glint of steel is as common as the glint of a sweaty brow. A group of them turns to watch you pass. Their eyes travel over you, not with curiosity, but with a flat, appraising stare, the way a butcher might look at a side of meat. You instinctively pull your thin shawl tighter and fix your gaze on the mud-caked heels of the man leading you. You are a novelty, but a common one, a fresh face in a place that consumes them quickly. This is the reality of the so-called pirate Republic of Nassau in the early 18th century. After the War of the Spanish Succession ended, thousands of privateers, essentially legal, state-sanctioned pirates, were suddenly out of a job. With their skills and ships, many turned to outright piracy. They needed a base, a place to sell their stolen goods, repair their ships, and spend their plunder without fear of a hangman's noose. Nassau, with its excellent harbor and a conveniently absent government, became their de facto capital. It was a free-for-all, a boomtown built on stolen sugar, indigo, and human misery. You sidestep a pig that is rooting enthusiastically in a pile of discarded oyster shells. Chickens scatter from your path, clucking indignantly. The sheer filth is staggering. There's no sanitation, no system for waste. Garbage is simply tossed into the street, where the animals in the oppressive heat do their slow, smelly work. This is a small, often overlooked detail of pirate life, while we imagine them on the clean, Open sea. Their time ashore was spent in some of the most unhygienic conditions imaginable. Dysentery and typhoid were likely as dangerous as a Spanish cannonball. The man leading you finally grunts something. Freedom. See, he waves a hand at the squalor. The armed men. The general air of menace. No king. No governor. A man can be himself here. You don't reply. His idea of freedom feels like your worst nightmare. This is the central debate that still fascinates historians. Was this a genuine, if crude, experiment in libertarianism and democracy? A place where sailors escaped the brutal tyranny of naval and merchant captains to create their own codes and pirate articles. Their codes of conduct suggest a surprising degree of fairness and democratic process on board their ships. But did that translate to life ashore, or was Nassau simply an anarchic mess, where the only law was the one enforced by the strongest arm and the quickest pistol for you, walking through its heart? The academic debate is meaningless. The only truth you feel is vulnerability. You pass other women. Some are gathered by a will, their faces hard and weary. One, a young woman with a vacant look in her eyes, sits on the steps of a crude storefront, holding a clay pipe. She doesn't seem to see you. Another, older and dressed in clothes that were once fine but are now stained and frayed, shouts a string of curses at a sailor who stumbles into her. He just laughs and shoves her aside. No one intervenes. Your guide steers you towards one of the largest buildings. A two-story wooden structure from which the loudest noise seems to emanate. It's a tavern. That much is clear. The sound of raucous singing, punctuated by the slam of a tankard on a table, spills out of the open doorway. The smell hits you from 10 paces away, a potent wave of stale rum, sweat, and unlit pipe tobacco. It's a warm, cloying, human smell. Above the door, a crudely painted sign creaks in the sea breeze, depicting a grinning skull. This, it seems, is where you're headed, the place that will be your new home, and your cage. The man shoves you, not unkindly but with an impatient finality, through the tavern's open doorway. You stumble from the blinding sunlight into a cavern of perpetual twilight. The air inside is even thicker than it was on the street, heavy with the smells you noticed before, now concentrated and mixed with the aroma of roasting meat and wood smoke. A haze of tobacco smoke hangs in the air, catching the few shafts of light that pierce through the grimy, shuttered windows, making them look like solid, dusty pillars. Your eyes slowly adjust to the gloom. The room is large and low-ceilinged. The wooden beams above you dark with soot. The floor is made of wide, uneven planks, slick with spilled drink and littered with discarded food scraps. A large stone hearth dominates the far wall, a fire crackling within it despite the oppressive heat of the day. This is the common room, the heart of the establishment. It's crowded and loud, a swirling sea of boisterous, drunken men. They sit hunched over rough-hewn tables on mismatched stools and benches, shouting at each other over the din. A woman moves through the crowd, carrying a tray of pewter tankards. She navigates the chaos with a practiced, weary grace, sidestepping a lurching sailor without spilling a drop. Her face is sharp and tired, but she manages a brutal smile for a man who grabs at her apron. She is one of them, one of you. Your guide leads you past the boisterous main room, towards a narrow, steep staircase tucked into a shadowy corner. The noise of the common room fades slightly as you ascend, replaced by the creaking of the wooden steps beneath your feet. The air gets hotter. Stay low. As you climb away from the relative ventilation of the ground floor, you reach a short, dark hallway. There are several doors, all closed. He stops at one and pushes it open without knocking. The room is small, barely large enough for the narrow cot pushed against one wall and a small, rickety wooden chest at its foot. There's a single, small window, covered not with glass but with a shutter made of thin, greased parchment, which casts a sickly, yellow light into the tiny space. It's stiflingly hot up here, directly under the sun-baked roof. This is it. This is your new home. A woman is sitting on the edge of the court, She is older than the girl downstairs, with strands of grey in her tightly bound hair. She looks up as you enter, her eyes sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. This is the proprietor's, the madam, the owner of this establishment and, by extension, you, her name. You'll learn, is Eleanor, or something like it. Names here are often temporary, adopted for convenience or to hide a past. She looks you up and down, a slow, methodical assessment that makes you feel like livestock at a market. She doesn't ask your name or where you're from. Those details are irrelevant. All that matters is what you are now. She speaks, her voice slow and raspy, a voice accustomed to being heard over the noise of the tavern. Shall do, she says to the man. A dismissal. He grunts and disappears back down the stairs, his part in your story finished. Now it's just you and her. She gestures to the cot. You sleep here. Return. She works the nights you don't. The idea of sharing this tiny, suffocating space with a stranger is just another small degradation you don't have the energy to protest. And is probably the girl with the vacant eyes you saw on the steps. The tavern you're in is the central institution of a pirate port. It was just a place to drink. It was a bank, a recruitment center, a marketplace for stolen goods, and a lodging house for pirates flush with cash. It was the primary place to spend it as quickly and recklessly as possible. For the women who worked in them, these taverns were a complete, self-contained world. They weren't owned operated by men, or, more surprisingly, sometimes by shrewd and ruthless women like Eleanor. Historical records, like the census of Port Royal from 1680, list a surprising number of female tavern owners. These women were often former prostitutes themselves who had managed, against all odds, to save or secure enough capital to become the exploiters rather than the exploited. They understood the grim economics of the business better than anyone. Eleanor stands up and walks towards you. She's not tall, but she carries herself with an authority that makes her seem larger. There are rules, she says, her voice leaving no room for argument. You work when I say, you see who I say, and you cause no trouble. She pauses, her eyes narrowing. Understand you not. A small, jerky movement. The word work hangs in the air between you, its meaning brutally clear. She points to the small wooden chest. Your things go in there. What little you have, it's a laughable statement. You have nothing but the clothes on your back. This room isn't just where you'll sleep. It's a symbol of your new status. Academics who study the architecture of these places note how the spaces for women were almost always on the upper floors, tucked away, out of sight. They were simultaneously central to the tavern's economy and physically marginalized within it. They were private spaces for public women, a paradox that defined their existence. This tiny, hot room is not a sanctuary. It's a holding cell, a place to keep you until you are needed downstairs. It's the closest thing to a home you will have, in a place that has no real homes at all. Eleanor gestures for you to follow her back down the creaking stairs. As you descend, the wall of noise from the common room rises to meet you again. This time, however, you're not just passing through. She leads you to a small, cluttered room behind the main bar, a space that serves as her office. It smells of ink, stale beer, and old paper. A single candle sputters on a heavy wooden desk, illuminating a large, leather-bound ledger that lies open. This book is the heart of her entire operation. It is, you will come to understand, the real set of chains that will bind you to this place far more effectively than any iron shackle. She dips a quill into an ink pot and looks at you expectantly. Name, she asks, her tone flat. You tell her your first name, softly. She probably doesn't care if it's real or not. She scratches it into the book. Then, the accounting begins. For your passage from wherever you came from, she says, not bothering to look up. That will be 50 pieces of 8. She makes a mark in a column next to your name, 50 silver dollars. It's an astronomical sum. More money than you have ever seen in your life. You have no way of knowing if that's what the man who brought you was actually paid. It's a number she has simply invented. For your room and board, and you'll be fed from the tavern kitchen, that will be 2 pieces of 8 a week. Another set of scratches in the ledger. For your clothing, you can't work in those rags, that will be another 20. You stare at her, a cold dread seeping into your bones. Before you have even begun, you are 70 pieces of 8 in debt. This is a system of debt peonage that trapped countless women in these establishments. It was a vicious, unbreakable cycle. You had to work to pay off the debt. But the cost of your own survival, food, lodging, the very clothes on your back, was constantly added to the tally. The house, in this case Eleanor, always won. She points a finger at you. The nail yellowed and thick. Everything you earn. Every coin a man gives you. It comes to me. I will mark it here. She taps the ledger against what you owe. Once you are clear of your debt, you are free to go. The lie hangs in the air, so blatant it's almost funny. You both know that day will never come. The numbers are designed to be impossible. This is a cold, hard fact of life for the unfree laborers of the 17th and 18th centuries. From indentured servants on tobacco plantations to the women in this tavern, the bookkeeping was the weapon. Historians who have studied these account books, the few that survive, see the stark reality. They list names next to staggering debts, with pitiful earnings trickling in. They show deductions for everything: a broken plate, a fine for being late, a new pair of shoes. It was a system of absolute economic control. There is some debate among scholars about whether any women ever managed to pay their way out. The evidence is slim to none. More likely, the only escape was death, or becoming so old or sick that you were no longer profitable, at which point you were simply cast out. Eleanor closes the ledger with a soft thud. The sound seems to echo in the small room. A sound of finality. Now, about your earnings, she continues, her voice taking on a slightly more business-like tone. For your time, a man will pay 1 piece of 8. Maybe 2 if he is a captain or has had a very good haul. Of that, you will keep 1/8. You do the quick, desperate math in your head. For every 8 silver coins you earn, you get to keep 1. The other 7 go to her, and from your single coin, you must hope to save enough too. What, by a ribbon, a bit of extra food, the hope of ever paying down the 70 piece of 8 mountain with fractions of a single coin is laughable. It's a cruel joke. This division of earnings was common. The tavern keeper or madame took the vast majority, justifying it as covering the costs of the business protection, bribes to the right people, food, and lodging. Your share was barely enough to subsist on, let alone save. It ensured you were always dependent, always hungry, always needing the next customer just to get by. A key cold case in history revolves around the true identities of these madams. Were women like Eleanor operating alone? Or were they fronts for powerful male pirates or merchants? Some Port Royal records suggest links between prominent men in tavern ownership, implying a hidden, more structured hierarchy of exploitation. Answering this would reveal if the system was just opportunistic chaos or a calculated business model run by the pirate elite. Eleanor sees the look on your face, the dawning horror, the flicker of despair. She offers no sympathy. This is business. She pushes a small, rough spun bag into your hand. It contains a few coins. This is a loan, she says, so you can buy a drink for yourself tonight. Look like you belong. Look happy. She is essentially making you pay to look appealing to the men who will pay to use you. With money you will have to pay back to her. The circular logic of it is dizzying. You clutch the small bag. The coins feel heavy, like stones. This is your life now. A name in a book. A list of debts you can never repay. The rules of the game have been laid out. It's a game you are guaranteed to lose. The only question is how long you can stand to play. Eleanor leads you out her stuffy office and back up the stairs, this time to a different room. It's a storage closet, ready, filled with bolts of cheap cloth, spare bedding, and the faint, musty smell of mothballs and damp wool. From a large wooden trunk, she pulls out a dress. It's a shock of color in the gloom. A gown of deep crimson fabric, with a bodice trimmed in what looks like, from a distance, gold lace. She holds it up against you. It's clearly not made for you, it's too large in the shoulders and a bit too short. But that's not the point. The point is the impression it creates. "This will do for tonight," she says, her voice devoid of any warmth. 20 pieces of 8. I've added it to your account. You stare at the dress. It's probably the most expensive thing you have ever touched. And you already hate it. It's not a gift, it's another link in the chain of your debt. The fabric, which looked rich in the dim light, is actually a coarse, heavy wool, dyed a garish red. The gold lace is just cheap yellow thread, already fraying in places. It's a costume, a stage prop for the role you are now expected to play. You take off your own clothes, the simple, sweat-stained, travel-worn dress that is the last remnant of your previous life. It feels like shedding your own skin. You pull the red gown over your head. The wool is scratchy against your skin. The bodice is stiff, reinforced with hollow bone stays that dig into your ribs, forcing you to stand up straighter and pushing your chest up and forward. It's designed not for comfort, but for display. This is a crucial detail often masked in pirate fantasies. The clothing worn by women in these taverns wasn't about personal expression. It was a uniform and an investment made by the house. Madams would purchase dresses, often second-hand or made from cheap but flashy materials, to make their girls more appealing to sailors who had been at sea for months, starved for any sign of feminine finery. The cost of this uniform was, of course, passed directly onto the woman, ensuring she was in debt from the very beginning. The dress was both a lure for customers and a tool of control. You look down at yourself. The crimson is loud, aggressive. In a room full of men dressed in drab browns and greys, you will be impossible to ignore. That's the entire point. You are no longer a person, you are a splash of color, a focal point, an object of attention. Eleanor hands you a pair of stockings and worn, buckled shoes that pinch your toes. She even produces a small pot of rouge. She dips her finger in the red paste and daubs it roughly onto your cheeks. No one pays for a sad face. She mutters, more to herself than to you. The rouge feels greasy and strange on your skin. It's a mask. There's a small, cracked piece of a mirror hanging on the wall, and you catch a glimpse of yourself. The person staring back is a stranger. A painted doll in a gaudy dress, with flushed cheeks and wide, fearful eyes. The clothes are wearing you, not the other way around. One of the more peculiar and debated historical tidbits is the origin of these clothes. While many were likely sorts from local seamstresses or bought from traders, some historians speculate that a portion of the finery in pirate ports was actually stolen goods. A pirate ship might capture a merchant vessel carrying textiles or even finished gowns intended for wealthy colonial ladies in places like Charleston or Bridgetown. These items, unsuited for the pirates themselves, would be sold or bartered in ports like Nassau. So, it's entirely possible that the dress you are now wearing was once destined for a governor's ball, making its journey from a symbol of colonial aristocracy to a tool of exploitation in a pirate tavern. The irony is as thick as the scratchy wool. Eleanor seems satisfied. She tugs at the bodice one last time, a final adjustment to the product, and will be down soon. Watch her. Learn. She turns to leave, then pauses at the door. And try not to spill anything on the dress. You'll pay for the cleaning. The door closes, and you are left alone in the stuffy room, encased in your new, expensive skin. The dress is heavy, not just with the weight of the fabric, but with the weight of expectation. It's an advertisement. Every thread proclaims your availability, your purpose in this place. You touch the cheap lace at your neckline. It feels flimsy, easily torn. You wrap your arms around yourself, the rough wool scratching your arms. This isn't a piece of clothing. It's a cage made of fabric, a price tag you wear on your body, and the cost, you realize with a sinking heart, is far more than 20 pieces of 8. The sun began its slow descent. painting the hazy sky in bruised purples and oranges. Though little of that light penetrated your stifling little room upstairs, you could hear the tavern below growing louder, a restless hum that was gradually rising to a roar. The individual shouts and clanging of tankers began to merge into a single, overwhelming wave of sound. This was it. The time for the men to come ashore. You stood by the small, parchment-covered window, pressing your cheek against the rough wood of the frame. Through the greasy parchment, the world outside was a blurry watercolor, but you could hear them. The deep, guttural shouts carried on the evening breeze. Mixed with the creak of timber and the slosh of water, it was the sound of ships coming into harbor. Not just any ships, but pirate ships. They were returning, heavy with plunder and even heavier with anticipation, after weeks or months at sea. This was the economic pulse of the port. Pirate havens thrived on the return of these vessels. They weren't just ships, they were floating treasuries, bringing in wealth, goods, and, most importantly, the men ready to spend their ill-gotten gains. When a ship was sighted on the horizon, the whole town would hum with a mixture of excitement and dread. For the tavern owners, it meant a deluge of business. For the women, it meant the start of their desperate, long nights. You heard the distinct thud of heavy boots on the wooden street below, followed by a surge in the noise from the tavern's main room. They were here, your first guests. You took a deep, shaky breath, the scratchy wool of the crimson dress rubbing against your collarbone. Eleanor had given you a small, cracked mirror before she left, urging you to fix yourself. The rouge felt like a clown's mask, but you had applied it. Your hair, hastily combed, was pulled back from your face. There was nothing more you could do. Downstairs, the common room had transformed. It was no longer just boisterous, it was a swirling, churning chaos of men. They clapped each other on the back, slammed tankards down with bone-jarring force, and shouted orders at the barmaids. Their faces, weathered by sun and sea, were flushed with rum and excitement. Their eyes, though, were what struck you. They held a wild, untamed glint, a mixture of recklessness and exhaustion. These were not the dashing, witty adventurers of tales. These were hard men, scarred by battle and hardened by a life of brutality. One particular mainstream historical fact about these pirates, often overlooked, is their age. While we might imagine grizzled, old soaks, many of these men were shockingly young. A significant portion of pirate crews were in their late teens or early 20s, driven to piracy by a lack of opportunity, harsh conditions and legitimate navies, or simply the allure of quick wealth and a life without rules. This youth, combined with the extreme danger and violence of their profession, often led to an exaggerated sense of invincibility and a brutal recklessness when ashore. They had lived with death for so long that they barely registered the consequences of their actions, especially after a few flagons of rum. You watched as a particularly large man, his beard matted and his clothes stained, threw a heavy pouch onto a table, scattering coins. His shipmates gathered around, cheering him on. He was ordering rounds for everyone. The sound of their celebration was deafening. A cold, odd historical tidbit is that pirates often had surprisingly advanced medical practices for their time, at least for each other, while they had no concept of modern hygiene. Pirate ships frequently had a surgeon on board, often a skilled individual who could perform amputations or patch up sword wounds with a surprising degree of success. This was a stark contrast to their behavior ashore. Once on land and drunk, all restraint vanished. The very men who might have nursed a shipmate through a fever at sea would, on land, be the first to start a brawl over a slight, or destroy a tavern in a fit of drunken rage. This duality is something historians still puzzle over. How did such organized and interdependent communities at sea descend into such chaos and brutality on land? You saw Eleanor talking to one of the newly arrived captains, her face a mask of polite deference mixed with shrewd calculation. She would be assessing his crew, their likely wealth, and how long they might stay in port. Her business depended on it. Then, she caught your eye and beckoned you over with a curt nod. Your stomach lurched. This was it. You moved through the crowded room, trying to make yourself small, but the crimson dress made that impossible. Heads turned, voices hushed, then rose again, often accompanied by lewd remarks or propositions shouted over the noise. You kept your eyes down, focusing on placing one foot in front of the other, trying not to trip on the uneven floor. The heat from the bodies, the smell of unwashed men in cheap rum, closed in around you. You reached Eleanor. She grabbed your arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "This is Captain Thorne," she said, presenting you to a man whose face was a patchwork of scars. His eyes were bloodshot and his breath reeked of stale rum. He was not old, perhaps 30, but his face held the weariness of a man who had lived 100 lives. He looked at you, a slow, predatory gaze that made your skin crawl. "Fresh one." Eleanor, he slurred, the wide, unpleasant grin spreading across his face. "Good. The last one you had couldn't hold her liquor." He laughed, a deep, mirthless sound. Eleanor merely smiled, a tight, professional expression. "She's quiet, Captain, and eager to please." Eager to please. The words tasted like ash in your mouth. You were a product, described in terms of your utility. The captain reached out a hand. His fingers thickened callous, and roughly traced the line of your jaw. His touch was cold and impersonal. "She'll do," he said, echoing Eleanor's own words from earlier. He pulled a handful of Spanish silver coins from his pocket and threw them onto the table. They clattered loudly, a sound of grim finality. Historians still debate the extent to which pirate captains were able to control their crews on shore. While pirate articles enforced strict discipline at sea, the land was often a different story. Was it a calculated allowance for release after months of confinement? Or did the captains simply lose their authority once the law of drink and women took over for the women like you? Caught in the eye of this storm, the distinction between a disciplined pirate and a drunken brute was entirely academic. They were all dangerous, and you were at their mercy. This was not a romantic encounter. This was a transaction, raw and brutal, and it was just the beginning of your long night. Captain Thorne's hand, calloused and rough as a barnacle-encrusted plank, closed around your arm. He pulled you through the throng of men towards his table, a path clearing for him as if by an invisible force. His status, marked by the slightly better quality of his coat and the deference of his crew, gave him priority. You stumbled along beside him, the crimson dress feeling like a flag of surrender. He shoved a pewter tankard into your hand. It was heavy and filled to the brim with a dark, pungent liquid. Rum, you assumed, or some crude, locally distilled spirit that burned its way down your throat. "Drink," he commanded, his voice a low growl. You took a hesitant sip. It was harsh and fiery, and you had to suppress a cough. The men at his table roared with laughter. For the next hour, you sat there, a silent ornament in their circle of chaos. They told stories of their latest voyage, their voices loud and slurred, boasting of a Spanish galleon they had taken off the coast of Hispaniola. They spoke of violence with a casual, almost bored tone, as if describing a routine day's work. You learned that the fine lace on one man's cuffs had been stripped from the body of a wealthy passenger. The gold ring on another's finger had been pried from a dead man's hand. This was the source of their wealth, the lifeblood of this port. The Golden Age of Piracy was golden only for the pirates, and only for a short time, for everyone else. It was an age of terror on the high seas, merchant ships, fishing vessels, even small coastal communities were all fair game. The pirate's game was always someone else's catastrophic loss or loss of goods, of livelihood, and often, of life. Finally, Thorne grew tired of the noise. He stood up, pulling you with him. He threw a few more coins onto the table to pay for the drinks and then steered you towards the stairs. No one paid you any mind. This was the natural conclusion of the evening, as common as the sunrise. Upstairs, in the tiny, suffocating room that was not your own, The transaction was completed. It was a grim, mechanical process, devoid of any pretense of affection or even humanity. You were an object, a vessel for a man's drunken, pent-up frustrations after months at sea. You stared at a crack in the wooden wall, focusing on its shape, its texture, trying to transport your mind somewhere else. Anywhere else. When it was over, he tossed a single, heavy coin onto the thin blanket of the court. It landed with a soft, dull thud, a Spanish piece of 8, a silver dollar. It was worn smooth from circulation, the face of a long-dead Spanish king barely visible in the candlelight. He left without another word, his heavy boots thudding down the stairs. Eager to rejoin the revelry below, you were left in the sudden, ringing silence, the smell of his sweat and stale rum clinging to the air. You reached out a trembling hand and picked up the coin. It felt cold and heavy in your palm. This was it, the price of a piece of your soul. This single coin represented the entirety of the transaction. You thought of Eleanor's ledger, 1 piece of 8. 7/8 of it belonged to her. 1/8, the tiny fraction of this silver disc, was yours. The coins themselves are a fascinating historical artifact. These Spanish pieces of 8 were the world's first truly global currency, minted in staggering quantities from silver mined in places like Prostitute, Bolivia, often by enslaved or forced indigenous labor. Each coin that passed through a pirate's hand was part of a vast, brutal network of global exploitation. The silver was mined by the oppressed in the New World, minted by the Spanish Empire, stolen by pirates on the high seas, and then used to purchase the bodies of women like you in lawless ports. The coin in your hand was soaked in the misery of 3 continents. You clutched it tightly, the milled edge digging into your palm. This was your first earning, a dirty, tarnished piece of silver that felt more like a brand than a reward. It was a symbol of your complete and utter commodification. You were now officially part of the port's sordid economy. A strange, and still debated, aspect of this economy is what women did with the tiny fraction of money they were allowed to keep. Did they save it? Clinging to a futile hope of escape, did they spend it on small comforts, a ribbon, a bit of sugar, a new pipe, or did they, as some anecdotal accounts suggest, use it to gamble amongst themselves, creating a microeconomy of luck and despair within their own marginalized community? We have no ledgers for their lives, only for their debts. Their own financial world is a historical blind spot. You slid off the cot and walked to the small wooden chest at its foot. You lifted the lid and dropped the coin inside. It landed with a lonely, hollow clink. The sound seemed to mock you. This was the start of your savings. A single, dirty coin in an empty box. It was the first of many you would have to earn. A mountain of silver to be piled up one degrading encounter at a time. All to pay a debt that was designed to be unpayable. The game had begun, and you had just completed your first move. But you weren't a player. You were one of the pieces. The days that followed blurred into a grim, monotonous rhythm, dictated by the tides of men and drum. Nights were for work, a suffocating sequence of faces, rough hands, and the clink of coins you barely saw. Days were for a heavy, dreamless sleep that offered little rest. Your small room shared with Anne, the other girl, one of you coming in as the other went out, like ghostly roommates who rarely spoke. But there were moments, brief and fragile, when you could breathe. These moments were usually found in the back alley behind the tavern. It was a muddy, narrow space, cluttered with empty barrels and refuse, but it was away from the perpetual twilight and noise of the common room. This was where the women gathered. You found yourself there one sweltering afternoon, tasked by Eleanor with mending a torn sheet. Other women were there too, scrubbing laundry in wooden tubs filled with murky, precious water drawn from the town well, or sorting through beans, picking out the weevils. The air was thick with the smell of lice soap and damp earth. Clear, away from the appraising eyes of men, the women's faces lost some of their hardness. The forced smiles and brittle cheerfulness of the tavern floor melted away, revealing a profound, collective weariness. They worked with a quiet efficiency, their hands chapped in dread from the harsh soap. You sat on an overturned crate, your needle moving clumsily through the coarse fabric. At first, no one spoke to you. You were new, an unknown quantity, but gradually, the silence was broken. A woman named Mary, her hair the color of straw, asked you for a length of thread. Another, an older woman from the French islands named Isabel, offered you a piece of dried fruit she had managed to acquire. These small gestures were lifelines. In this back alley, a different kind of society existed. It wasn't built on currency or violence, but on shared experience and quiet empathy. They spoke in low tones, a mix of English, French, and a smattering of Spanish and African dialects. They talked about the mundane, the price of bread, a new shipment of cloth at the general store, the best way to get a wine stain out of a linen shirt. They also talked about the men, not as captains or fearsome pirates, but as problems to be managed. They shared warnings. Watch out for black-eyed Jack's crew, they're mean drunks. The quartermaster on the Sea Serpent is a pincher. If you get the one with the red scarf, make sure you get the coin first. Bade Chias a runner. It was a network of vital, life-saving information, a set of unwritten rules for survival passed from one woman to the next. This is a key aspect of life for marginalized groups throughout history. When formal structures of power and protection are absent, people create their own. These informal networks of women provided a semblance of community and safety in an environment that offered neither. They were a buffer against the daily brutality of their lives. You found yourself listening to their stories. Isabel spoke of her home, a place with sweet-smelling flowers and clear water, her voice soft with a nostalgia that was almost painful to hear. Mary, on the other hand, was pragmatic and cynical. She had been in Nassau for 3 years and had no illusions about her fate. Don't you go saving your aids, she advised you one day, noticing you carefully hoarding the tiny share of your earnings. Spend it. Buy a bit of ribbon. Get a piece of fresh fish from the dock. There's no buying your way out of this place. The book's always cooked. It was harsh advice, but it came from a place of grim reality, not cruelty. It was her way of offering you a coping mechanism. A particularly strange and poignant detail that emerges from the study of similar historical contexts is the importance of small, personal possessions. Archaeologists excavating sites of enslavement or extreme poverty often find things like handmade beads, carved tokens, or a single, fancy button. These objects had no real monetary value but were imbued with immense personal significance. They were a way of holding onto a piece of one's identity in a world that sought to strip it away completely. Perhaps the ribbon Mary advised you to buy wasn't just a frivolous purchase, it was an act of defiance. A small claim to beauty and selfhood in the face of overwhelming ugliness. You started to learn the faces and names, to understand the subtle hierarchy. There was a quiet respect for the older women like Isabel, who had survived for so long. There was a shared pity for the very young ones, whose initial shock and fear had not yet hardened into resignation. And there were moments of humor, dark and sharp as broken glass. They would mock the men's drunken boasts, perfectly imitating their slurred speech and swaggering walks. And for a moment, the alley would be filled with a sound you rarely heard: genuine, unforced laughter. It was a release, a way of cutting their oppressors down to size, if only for a few seconds. Historians still debate the extent and nature of these female friendships. Were they genuine bonds of solidarity, or were they fragile alliances, easily broken by jealousy or competition for the favor of a wealthy pirate? The truth is likely somewhere in between, in a system designed to pit them against each other. Every act of kindness was a small miracle. These relationships were complex, fraught with tension, but they were also, for many, the only thing that made life bearable. In that back alley, surrounded by the mundane tasks of survival, you felt a flicker of something you hadn't realized. You'd lost a sense of belonging. It was a fragile, compromised belonging, forged in shared misery, but it was something. You were not just a name in Eleanor's ledger. You were one of the women of the back alley, a member of a secret, silent sorority, bound together by the lyso, the dirty water, then the quiet, desperate hope of seeing another sunrise. One afternoon in the back alley, the usual low chatter of the women was even more hushed than normal. You noticed two of them, Mary and another girl, whispering in a corner, their heads close together. They kept casting furtive glances at a third woman, Elodie, who was sitting by herself, staring blankly at the wall. Elodie hadn't been down to the common room in nights. You caught fragments of their conversation, whispered words that sent a chill down your spine despite the sweltering heat. Words like the sickness, the pox, and the most dreaded of all, the French plague. You had heard these terms before, muttered in taverns and on the street, always in hushed, fearful tones. It was the shadow that hung over every single one of you, a far more constant and insidious threat than a pirate's cutlass, Suphamus. Later, Isabel, the older woman, sat down beside you as you were patching her shirt. Her face was grim. "You see Elodie?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. You nodded. "She has the signs. The rash, the sores in her mouth." Isabel shook her head slowly. "Eleanor will find out soon." And then, she didn't have to finish the sentence. This was the grim reality of life in a port city in the 18th century, especially one like this. Venereal diseases, particularly syphilis, were rampant, with no understanding of germ theory and no effective treatment. An infection was a slow, agonizing, and almost certain death sentence. For the women in the taverns, who were exposed to a constant stream of sailors from all over the world, the risk was astronomical. The disease, which had arrived in Europe from the Americas in the late 15th century, had become a terrifying pandemic. It was known by many names, often used to blame other nationalities: the French disease, the Spanish sickness, the Neapolitan disease. But whatever it was called, its effects were devastating and horrifically visible. The initial stages might involve a painless sore, followed by a rash, fever, and sore throat, but it was the tertiary stage that was truly feared. It could attack the brain, leading to madness. It could eat away at the cartilage of the nose, causing the bridge to collapse, a telltale sign of a long-term sufferer. It could cause painful, reaping sores, called gumers, to erupt all over the body. You looked over at Elodie again. She was young, no older than 20. She was just sitting there, a picture of despair. The other women kept their distance, a mixture of fear and pity in their eyes, fear of catching the disease, and pity for a fate they all knew could easily be their own. A strange, cold fact about this era is the public's awareness of the disease's symptoms. Because it was so common and so visible, people were intimately familiar with its progression. A collapsed nose or a certain type of skin lesion was instantly recognizable. This led to a cruel social calculus the moment a person, especially a woman in your profession, began to show the signs. She was immediately marked, ostracized, and her value plummeted to zero. She became a pariah, a walking ghost. Eleanor, with her sharp, practical eyes, would not tolerate a sick girl in her establishment. A diseased woman was bad for business. Not only could she not work, but her very presence was a deterrent to customers. As soon as Elodie's condition became undeniable, she would be turned out onto the street with nothing, to face the final, horrifying stages of the illness alone. You felt a knot of cold fear in your stomach. Every cough, every ache, every blemish on your skin would now be a source of anxiety. You were trapped in a game of Russian roulette, and every encounter with a man was another pull of the trigger. The academic world still debates the exact virulence and prevalence of syphilis during the Golden Age of Piracy. Some argue that the strains were particularly aggressive, leading to a more rapid and gruesome progression of the disease than is common today. Others suggest that the poor nutrition, lack of sanitation, and general hardship of life in a pirate port would have weakened people's immune systems, making them far more susceptible to the worst effects of the illness. without tissue samples. It's a question that may never be fully answered, but the anecdotal evidence from contemporary accounts paints a truly grim picture. That evening, you saw Eleanor go over to Elodie. There was no shouting, just a short, quiet conversation. Elodie didn't cry or protest. She just nodded, her face a blank mask of resignation. The next morning, she was gone. Her cot was empty, her few meager possessions left behind in the small wooden chest. No one said where she went. No one had to. She had been absorbed by the streets, another ghost to haunt the muddy lanes of Nassau. Her fate a silent, terrifying warning to all the women left behind. The whispers about the French plague died down again, but the fear remained, a permanent resident in the back of everyone's mind. The disappearance of Elodie cast a long, cold shadow over the tavern, a silent reminder of the razor's edge on which you all lived. But the rhythms of the port were relentless. Ships came and went, men drank and fought, and the nights continued their brutal march. It was a few evenings after Elodie was cast out that you learned the second great lesson of Nassau, a lesson as fundamental as the fear of disease. The only law here was violence. It started, as it so often did, over something small, a perceived slight, a spilled drink, a dispute over a card game. Two men, both from the same crew, their faces flushed with rum and bravado, began to argue. Their voices rose from a drunken slur to an angry roar, cutting through the general din of the common room. You were near the bar, fetching a tray of drinks, and you froze. Your first instinct was to make yourself invisible, to melt into the shadows, but you were wrapped between the bar and the escalating conflict. Other conversations in the tavern died down, the patrons turning to watch the unfolding drama. There was a tense, almost gleeful anticipation in the air. This was entertainment. One man, a weary fellow with a missing front tooth, accused the other, a barrel-chested brute, of cheating. The big man slammed his fist on the table, making the tankards jump. You call me a cheat, you dog, he bellowed, his face contorting with rage. The weary man, despite being half the other's size, was not backing down, his hand straight to the hilt of the long knife tucked into his belt. I call you what you are, a low-down, card-sharping thief. That was it, the point of no return. The big man roared and lunged across the table. The table overturned with a crash, sending pewter plates and food scattering across the floor. The two men were a tangle of flailing limbs, grunting and cursing as they wrestled in the filth. This was not a stylized sword fight from a storybook. It was a raw, ugly, clumsy brawl. They punched and kicked, pulling at hair and clothes. There were no rules, no honor. It was about pure, unrestrained aggression. Eleanor, who had been watching from the end of the bar, simply stepped back, her face a mask of weary annoyance. She made no move to intervene. This was a cost of doing business, like spilled rum or a broken chair. The other pirates in the room formed a loose circle around the fighters, shouting encouragement, some even placing bets. No one tried to stop them. This illustrates a core principle of pirate society ashore. While their shipboard articles often had strict rules against fighting on the vessel to maintain order and crew cohesion, these rules evaporated the moment they stepped on land. The tavern was a space of release, where the violence that was their trade could be turned inward, on each other. It was a pressure valve for a life lived under constant threat and tension. The weary man managed to get his knife out. It flashed in the lamplight. The crowd yelled in anticipation. But the bigger man was quicker. He grabbed the smaller man's wrist, and with a sickening crunch, you saw him twist it until the knife clattered to the floor. The weary man screamed. But a thin sound of pure agony. The big man wasn't finished. He pinned the smaller man to the floor and began to punch him in the face. Methodically, brutally. 1, 2, 3 heavy, meaty thud. You couldn't watch, but you couldn't look away. You saw blood. You saw the weary man go limp. Finally, the big man, panting heavily, stood up. He looked down at the unconscious form of his crewmate, spat on the floor beside him, and then turned to the bar. "Another rum," he shouted, as if nothing had happened. A few of the other men dragged the unconscious body out of the way, dumping it in a corner like a sack of grain. The noise in the tavern slowly returned to its previous level. The show was over. A strange and little-known aspect of pirate justice is that, for all this casual brutality, they had a surprisingly formal system for dealing with theft from each other. If a pirate was caught stealing from a crewmate's sea chest, the punishment was often marooning, being left on a deserted island. But for a public brawl like this, even one that resulted in serious injury, there was generally no punishment at all. The philosophical divide is fascinating to historians. Theft was a violation of the collective economic agreement and was punished formally, while personal violence was often seen as a private matter to be settled on the spot. Why was property more protected than people? The debate continues. But it suggests a worldview where a man's share of the plunder was more sacred than his physical safety. You stood there, your heart hammering against your ribs, the tray of drinks forgotten in your hands. You had just witnessed a man nearly beaten to death, and the only consequence was a mess to be cleaned up. You looked at Eleanor. She caught your eye and gestured with her chin towards the blood on the floor. "Get a bucket," she said, her voice flat. This was the law of Nassau. Not a law of kings or governors, but the law of the fist and the knife. There was no one to appeal to, no authority to call upon for protection. You were utterly, completely on your own. If a man decided to turn his anger on you, for any reason or for no reason at all, nothing and no one would stop him. Eleanor might object, but only if it was bad for business, not because she cared for your well-being. Your safety was not a right, it was a commodity, and its value was dangerously low. That brawl taught you that the physical threats were not just abstract possibilities. They were real, they were sudden, and they were a constant, terrifying presence in the very air you breathed. In the aftermath of the brawl, you learned another, more mundane truth about your existence. You were at the absolute bottom of the food chain. Literally, the tavern kitchen was a small, perpetually hot, and smoky annex at the back of the building, run by a grumbling, one-eyed man named Thomas. It was his job to feed the pirates, and what was left over was for you. The pirates ate like kings, or at least, like men who had recently stolen from kings. When a crew was in port, flush with cash from a successful raid, the kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. Thomas would be roasting whole pigs on a spit in the main hearth, the smell of sizzling fat filling the entire tavern. He diced huge pots of turtle meat, a delicacy in the Caribbean, seasoned with peppers and spices that had been part of their plunder. They feasted on fresh fish, bought directly from the docks, and great loaves of bread, baked fresh that day. You would watch them from the edges of the room, these men gorging themselves, tearing meat from the bone with their teeth, washing it down with flagons of rum. Their tables were a testament to their success, a chaotic landscape of discarded bones, half-eaten bread, and overturned tankards. This feasting was a vital part of the pirate lifestyle. After months, it's you subsisting on hardtack rock hard, unleavened biscuit and salted, often maggot Y meat. A fresh, hot meal was the ultimate luxury. It was a way to feel human again, to wash away the memory of deprivation. But you, and the other women, were not part of this feast. Your meals were an afterthought. Once the pirates had eaten their fill and stumbled away from the tables, either upstairs or back to their ships, it was your turn. Eleanor would instruct you and the other girls to clear the tables. What was salvageable became your dinner. You would gather in the smoky kitchen, around a rough wooden table, and pick at the leftovers, a chunk of pork that had fallen to the floor, wiped clean on an apron, the last, greasy dregs of a turtle stew, scraped from the bottom of the pot, a heel of bread, hard and stained with gravy. It was a meal of scraps, of remnants. This wasn't just about thriftiness on Eleanor's part, it was a clear and constant reinforcement of the social hierarchy. The paying customers, the men with the silver, ate first and best. You, the workers, the property, ate what was left. Malnutrition was a constant. Low-grade affliction. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant diseases like scurvy, which we typically associate with sailors on long voyages, were likely a problem ashore as well, leading to exhaustion, anemia, and weakened immune systems. This made you all the more vulnerable to the other diseases that plagued the port. One of the more curious food-related facts from this era is the pirates' love for a dish called samagnuti. It was a giant, chaotic salad, a signature pirate feast dish. A recipe might include chopped meats like pigeon, turk, and turtle, pickled herrings, mangoes, plum hearts, boiled eggs, onions, olives, and grapes, all arranged artfully on a platter and drenched in a vinaigrette of oil, vinegar, and spices. It was a representation of their global plundering on a single plate, ingredients from Europe, Africa, and the New World all thrown together. Historians debate whether this dish was a genuine pirate invention or an adaptation of a popular European dish, but its everything but the kitchen sink nature seems to perfectly capture the chaotic, multicultural, and plundering spirit of its creators. Of course, you would only ever see the messy, picked-over remains of such a feast. Sometimes, if a crew had been gone for a long time or if business was slow, the leftovers were meager. On those nights, your dinner would be what Thomas prepared for the lean times: a thin, watery grill made from oats or cornmeal, or more of the dreaded hardtack, softened slightly by dipping it in beer. On these nights, you would go to your cot with a gnawing emptiness in your stomach, the hunger a dull ache that made sleep difficult. You learned to be resourceful. You would squirrel away a piece of bread in your pocket when clearing the tables. You learned from Isabel which wild greens growing behind the tavern were safe to eat, and you would boil them to supplement your meager diet. These small acts of defiance, of self-preservation, were necessary for survival. The academic debate here focuses on the broader nutritional landscape of the 18th century Caribbean. Was the diet of the average person in a pirate haven actually worse than that of, say, a poor farmer in England or an indentured servant in Virginia? Some argue that the access to turtle meat and fresh fish might have made it better, while others contend that the lack of reliable agriculture, the focus on cash crops like sugar, and the chaotic supply chains made for a diet dangerously lacking in essential nutrients. Your aching stomach and the constant feeling of fatigue would have placed you firmly in the latter camp. Your relationship with food became one of desperation. You dreamed of simple things: an apple, a piece of cheese that wasn't crawling with maggots, a bowl of soup that was thick and nourishing. These were fantasies as wild and unattainable as the idea of freedom. Your daily meal of scraps was a constant, tangible reminder of your place in this world. You were not a guest at the feast of life, you were there to clean up the mess, and your hunger, a quiet and persistent companion, was just another chain binding you to this place. The constant malnutrition and the oppressive stampede left you in a perpetual state of weary lethargy. But there was another daily struggle, one that was surprisingly difficult and profoundly important: the struggle to stay clean. In a world awash with grime, the simple act of washing was a luxury and an act of defiance. Nassau, like most settlements of its kind, had no plumbing, no running water, no sewage system. Fresh water itself was a precious commodity. The main source was a communal well in the center of town, or perhaps a nearby stream. Every drop had to be hauled by hand in heavy wooden buckets. This water was used for everything: drinking, cooking, brewing, and, last of all, washing. The water you and the other women used for laundry in the back alley was often on its second or third use, grey and murky, barely cleaner than the clothes you were trying to wash. To wash yourself was an even greater challenge. There were no private bathrooms, no bathtubs. Your personal hygiene was a semi-public affair, conducted with a small basin of cold water in the corner of your shared room. Or, if you were bold, A quick, furtive scrub at the communal well very early in the morning before the town was fully awake. Soap was a harsh, lye-based substance that was rough on the skin and clothes. It was effective at cutting through grease and grime, but it left your skin feeling tight and dry. Despite these challenges, you and the other women clung to your routines of cleanliness with a fierce determination. It wasn't about vanity, it was about survival. In two fundamental ways. First, there was the practical, professional necessity. Eleanor insisted on it. A woman who was clean and smelled tolerable was more valuable than one who did not. It was part of the uniform, part of the package being sold. She would inspect your hands and face, and a fine could be deducted from your non-existent earnings for being deemed too dirty. But on a deeper, more personal level, the struggle for cleanliness was a struggle for dignity. In a life where your body was treated as a public commodity, washing it was an act of reclaiming it, even for a moment, to scrub away the grime of the tavern floor, the sweat of the day, and the lingering scent of the men you were forced to be with, was to feel, however briefly, that your body was your own. It was a ritual of purification, a way to wash away the shame and degradation, if only on the surface. This obsession with personal hygiene in unhygienic surroundings is a fascinating paradox. We often have a cartoonished image of people in the past as being universally filthy. But personal accounts and court records from the period often show a great deal of concern for cleanliness, especially among women. It was associated with respectability, piety, and health. For a woman in your position, stripped of all conventional respectability, clinging to the ritual of cleanliness was a way to hold on to a shred of self-worth. You would watch Isabel carefully wash her face each morning, using a small, clean piece of linen as a cloth. You saw Mary take great pains to wash and mend her single spare shift, laying it out on a bush to dry in the hot sun. These were small acts, but they were significant. They were a way of saying, I am not just dirt. I am not just a thing to be used and discarded. I still exist. A weird, related historical fact is the 18th century European upper class's fear of full-body immersion in water. Many physicians of the time believed that bathing in hot water opened the pores and allowed miasmas, or disease-carrying vapors, to enter the body. As a result, the wealthy often dry clean themselves, using perfumed powders and linen cloths to rub themselves down, while only washing their hands and face, in a strange inversion. The common person's simple scrub with cold water and lye soap, while less pleasant, was likely more hygienic. The academic debate on this topic centers on whether these acts of hygiene were a form of resistance or merely a form of compliance with the demands of the trade. Was a woman washing herself to maintain her own sense of self, or was she simply polishing the product as her owner demanded the truth? As is so often the case, is that it was likely both at the same time. The motive may have come from Eleanor, but the meaning was created by you. The act of washing was both a to love your oppression and a to love your survival. One evening, you managed to trade a small favor mending a shirt for one of the cooks for a bucket of tolerably clean, warm water from the kitchen. You hauled it up to your tiny room, barred the door, and for the first time in weeks, you washed yourself from head to foot. The feeling of the warm water on your skin was a shock, a forgotten pleasure, as you scrubbed your skin raw with the harsh soap. You weren't just washing away dirt. You were trying to scrub away the memory of Captain Thorne's hands, the smell of the tavern smoke, the despair that clung to you like a second skin. For those 10 minutes, in the privacy of your sweltering little room, you were not a commodity. You were just a woman, alone with her body, in a desperate, fleeting, and profoundly human struggle for a moment of peace. As you settled into the grim routine of your life, the constant, chaotic noise of the port began to resolve itself into something you could almost understand. It was just a wall of sound, it was a language. Or rather, a multitude of languages, all clashing and merging in the humid air. The dominant language of the tavern was, of course, a rough, profanity-laced version of English, the mother tongue of most of the pirates who frequented Nassau. But it was an English heavily seasoned with words and phrases from a dozen other places. You started to pick it up, not through formal learning, but through osmosis. You learned sailors' slang for everything. The floor was the deck. The walls were bulkheads, and right and left were starboard and port. You learned that a piece of eight was often called a dollar or a carp, and that a doubloon was the gold coin that could make a man's eyes light up with greed. But mixed into this nautical English was a rich stew of other tongues when the French privateers, or filibusters, were in port. The tavern buzzed with the rapid-fire cadence of their language. You learned to recognize their curses and their words for wine and woman. You saw them haggling with Spanish-speaking smugglers, who came in small, fast sloops from Cuba or Santo Domingo to trade tobacco and sugar for stolen English goods. Their conversations were a mix of broken Spanish, English, and hand gestures. This linguistic melting pot was a defining feature of the pirate world. A typical pirate crew was a surprisingly international affair. A single ship might have Englishmen, Scotsmen, Welshmen, Irishmen, Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Swedes, and a significant number of freed or escaped African slaves and displaced Native Americans. They were a microcosm of the entire Atlantic world, a floating United Nations of outlaws. This diversity was a strength at sea, bringing a wide range of skills. But it meant that communication could be a challenge. To solve this, they often spoke a type of pidgin or Creole simplified, blended language that allowed them to communicate the essentials. The most famous of these is the lingua franca of the Mediterranean, but a similar phenomenon happened in the Caribbean. The language you were hearing in the tavern was a living, breathing example of this process. One of the most fascinating and historically debated linguistic contributions of piracy is the origin of what we think of as the stereotypical pirate accent, the "all Jim lad" of popular culture. There is virtually no historical evidence that pirates in the Golden Age actually spoke this way. The accent is largely a 20th century invention, popularized by the actor Robert Newton in his portrayal of Long John Silver in the 1950 Disney film Treasure Island. Newton was from the West Country of England, and he used his native Dorset dialect for the role. It stuck. And now we can't imagine a pirate sounding any other way. The real sound of a pirate would have been a chaotic jumble of a dozen different accents and languages. For you, learning this blended language was another to love survival. You learned to distinguish a Dutchman's accent from a Welshman's. You learned that when a man calls for grog, he wanted rum diluted with water. You learned the Spanish word for hurry, pronto, because you heard it shouted so often. This linguistic soup wasn't just practical, it was also isolating. You could understand the surface level, the orders for drinks, the crude propositions, the boasts and threats, but the nuances, the jokes, the stories told in a thick brogue or a rapid-fire patois were often lost on you. You were surrounded by conversation, but rarely part of it. You existed in a state of semi-comprehension, able to navigate the world but never truly connect with it. Even among the women, there were language barriers. You learned a few words of French from Isabelle and a smattering of the Yoruba language from a quiet, dignified woman named Desi, who had been captured from a slave ship. These exchanges were small bridges across the chasm of their different pasts. Sharing a word for water or pain was a way of acknowledging their shared humanity. Historians who study Creole languages often look to places like 18th century Nassau as linguistic laboratories. How quickly did these new, blended languages form? Who were the primary innovators? The sailors, the merchants, or perhaps the women and children who had to navigate this multicultural environment every day? The ephemeral, spoken nature of these languages makes them incredibly difficult to study, relying on chance mentions in letters or court documents. Your daily life was at the heart of a linguistic phenomenon that scholars can now only guess at. One night, a sailor, new to the port and very drunk, tried to speak to you in what you thought was German. You couldn't understand a word. You just shook your head, a helpless gesture. He became angry, his frustration boiling over. He saw your lack of understanding not as a language barrier, But, as defiance, he grabbed your arm, his voice rising. Before it could escalate, another pirate at the table, an older man with a faded tattoo of a mermaid on his arm, growled something at the drunk in the same language. The drunk immediately let go of you and slunk away. The older pirate looked at you and said, in heavily accented but clear English, "He is a fool. Pay him no mind." In that moment, you understood. Language was power. Understanding it could save you. Not understanding it could put you in mortal danger. Your world was a confusing, chaotic babble, and your survival depended on learning to decipher its strange and dangerous grammar. Your life began to settle into a new kind of calendar, one that had nothing to do with months or seasons. It was governed by the erratic, unpredictable schedule of the sea. Your existence was a cycle of feast and famine, of overwhelming chaos and unnerving quiet, all dictated by the presence or absence of pirate ships in the harbor. When the harbour was full, the tavern was a roaring, 24-hour vortex of activity. The crews, flush with prize money, would descend upon the town like a conquering army, their only goal to divest themselves of their silver as quickly and as loudly as possible. These were the times of endless work, of nights that blurred into days. You would be on your feet for hours on end, carrying trays of drinks, dodging groping hands, enduring the drunken advances of man after man, and trying to keep the crimson dress from being torn or irrevocably stained. The noise was relentless, a physical force that battered you. Sleep was a luxury, snatched in 1 or 2 hour increments in the stifling heat of your room, your ears still ringing with the phantom sounds of the common room. The demand for your time, and your body, was constant. Eleanor would work you to the point of exhaustion, driven by the need to extract every possible coin from the sailors before they sobered up or shipped out. During these periods, the shared moments of peace in the back alley vanished. Everyone was too busy, too tired. The only solidarity was a shared look of bone-deep weariness exchanged across the crowded room. And then, just as suddenly, they would be gone. One morning you would wake to a strange and unfamiliar sound silence. The ships would have slipped out with the pre-dawn tide, their sails catching the offshore breeze, heading back to the vast, empty horizon to hunt for more prey. On these days, the tavern was a ghost of itself. The common room, empty and smelling of stale rum and regret, seemed cavernous. The floor would be a disaster zone of broken furniture, spilled drink, and discarded food, and your first task of the day would be to help clean it all up. These were the lean times, with no sailors to spend money. The port's economy ground to a halt. The blacksmith's hammer was quiet. The merchants in their small shops sat idly in their doorways. For you and the other women, it was a time of anxious waiting. The income, meager as it was, stopped completely, but Eleanor's ledger did not. The 2 pieces of 8 for your room and board were still added to your debt each week, regardless of whether you earned a single coin. The mountain of what you owed grew relentlessly, whether the harbor was full or empty. This was the genius of her system. You fell deeper into her trap, even when you were idle. These quiet periods were a strange mix of relief and dread. The relief was physical. Your body had time to recover. The bruises faded. The exhaustion receded from a sharp, stabbing pain to a dull, constant ache. You could sleep for more than a few hours at a time. You had long, empty afternoons to sit in the back alley with the other women, to mend your clothes, to simply sit and stare into space. But the relief was overshadowed by a gnawing anxiety. The quiet meant hunger. During the lean times, the kitchen offered only the barest subsistence, then gruel and hardtack. The feasts were a distant memory. You could feel yourself growing weaker, the hollow feeling in your stomach a constant companion. A surprisingly detailed aspect of pirate economics that historians have pieced together is the credit system that existed in these ports. Tavern keepers like Eleanor often extended credit to pirates they trusted, allowing them to drink and eat on the account until they returned with their next prize. This created a symbiotic, if tense, relationship, but this credit system rarely, if ever, extended to the women. The pirates were an investment that might pay off. You were just an expense. The debate among historians is whether this system was a form of social cohesion or just another clever business tactic to ensure pirates returned to a specific port and a specific tavern, thereby guaranteeing future income. During one particularly long lull, when no ships had been sighted for over 3 weeks, the mood in the tavern turned sour. Eleanor was tense and short-tempered. The food was scarcer than ever. You saw one of the younger girls, desperate with hunger, tried to steal a loaf of bread from the kitchen. Thomas, the one I'd cooked, caught her. He didn't hit her. He just took the bread back and reported her to Eleanor, who added a fine of 5 pieces of 8 to the girl's debt for the attempted theft. The punishment was, as always, financial. It was during these quiet times that the hopelessness of your situation felt most acute. During the chaos, you were too busy, too overwhelmed to think, but in the silence, there was nothing to distract you from the grim reality you were a prisoner. Your cage defined not by iron bars, but by the endless blue horizon of the sea. Your fate was tied to the whims of men you despised. Your well-being dependent on the violence they perpetrated on others far away. You would find yourself scanning the horizon, just as Eleanor did, but with a terrible mix of emotions. The sight of a sail was both a promise and a threat. It meant the return of food, of noise, of activity, but it also meant the end of peace, the return of the fear, the resumption of the work. You were trapped, wishing for the ships to come and dreading their arrival, all at the same time. Your life was a tide, pulling you back and forth between 2 different kinds of misery. In the low, quiet days of waiting, you began to learn another language, one that had nothing to do with words. It was the language of superstition. The pirates, for all their swagger and brutality, were a deeply superstitious lot. Their lives were governed by chance, by the unpredictable moods of the wind and sea, and they sought to control their dangerous world through a complex web of beliefs, omens, and rituals. You learned these beliefs not because you shared them, but because understanding them was crucial for navigating your interactions with the men, knowing what to say, and more importantly, what not to say, could be the difference between a peaceful transaction and a violent outburst. You learned, for example, to never whistle on the tavern's porch. Whistling was believed to whistle up a storm, and even on land, far from any ship's deck, the superstition held strong. You saw a new girl, unaware of the rule, softly whistling a tune to herself one evening. A grizzled old pirate, his face a mask of fury, stormed over and threatened to cut out her tongue if she did it again. The fear in his eyes was genuine. He believed her innocent act was a direct threat to the lives of his shipmates who were still at sea. You learned that Fridays were unlucky days to set sail, that spilling salt was a bad omen that had to be counted by throwing a pinch over your left shoulder, and that killing an albatross was a grave sin against the sea itself. You heard them speak of Crake and Ness in the deep, of mermaids who lured sailors to their deaths, and of the ghostly, spectral ship, the Flying Dutchman, doomed to sail the seas forever. These beliefs were a way of making sense of a world that was largely incomprehensible and hostile. In an age before modern meteorology or navigation, a sudden storm or a ship lost without a trace could only be explained by the supernatural. Superstition provided a framework of cause and effect, however illogical, giving the men a semblance of control over their fates. One of the most mainstream and well-documented pirate superstitions was their belief about women on board a ship. It was considered extremely bad luck to have a woman on a vessel during a voyage. They were thought to distract the crew and anger the sea, which was often personified as a fickle, jealous goddess. This is one of the reasons that the few female pirates who are known to history, like Bonnie and Mary Red, had to disguise themselves as men to be accepted into a crew. Of course, this superstition conveniently vanished the moment a ship was safely in port, where women were not just tolerated, but aggressively sought out. The hypocrisy was stark, but no one seemed to notice or care. You began to use this knowledge to your advantage. You learned to affect a solemn nod when a sailor spoke of a bad omen. You could earn a moment of goodwill by telling a man that his new tattoo of a pig and a rooster, one on each foot, was a powerful charm against drowning, as those animals, unable to swim, were believed to be eager to get to shore. A particularly strange and obscure piece of sailor folklore involved cats. Unlike women, cats were considered extremely good luck to have on board a ship. They were practical, of course, as they hunted the rats that could destroy a ship's ropes and food stores. But the superstition went deeper. A ship's cat was believed to have magical powers. It could predict the weather if it was frisky. A storm was coming if it sneezed. It was a sign of rain. A black cat was considered the luckiest of all. Hurting a ship's cat was one of the worst things a sailor could do, guaranteed to bring ruin upon the entire vessel. You saw pirates who would casually commit acts of extreme violence against their fellow men treat the tavern's mangy cat with a gentle, almost reverent respect. The historical debate around this topic is whether these superstitions were genuinely held beliefs or simply a part of the performance of being a sailor. Did these hard, cynical men truly believe that a cat could control the weather, or was it more of a tradition? A set of shared cultural touchstones that bonded them together as a community? The answer is probably a bit of both. For some, the fear of the Flying Dutchman was as real as the fear of a Spanish warship. For others, it was just part of the language of the sea. One night, a pirate captain, a man known for his cruelty, was preparing to leave. He was drunk and morose, convinced his voyage was doomed because he had seen a single magpie, a terrible omen, that afternoon. He was complaining loudly, spreading his gloom to his crew. You, emboldened by a sip of rum Eleanor had given you to liven you up, approached his table. "But Captain," you said, your voice soft, "did you not see the pod of dolphins that followed your ship into the harbor yesterday? That is a powerful sign of good fortune. They were guiding you to a safe return." He stopped, his bloodshot eyes fixing on you. You had seen no dolphins. You had completely invented it. But you said it with a conviction you did not feel. He stared at you for a long moment. Then a slow smile spread across his scarred face. Bye, he said, his mouth lifting visibly. Bye, the dolphins. A good omen indeed. He tossed a silver coin on your tray, a coin you didn't have to go upstairs to earn. It was a payment for a different kind of service. You hadn't sold your body, but you had sold a comforting lie. You realized then that superstition was a currency. Just like silver, it was a language of fear and hope. And in a world where you had so little power, learning to speak that language gave you a small, but vital, tool for survival. You could soothe a man's fear, or perhaps even stoke it, with a well-chosen word. It was a dangerous game, but it was one of the only ones you could actually play. The relentless sun, the meager diet, the long nights, and the constant, gnawing stress began to take their toll, not just on your spirit, but on your physical form. The change was gradual at first, a subtle erosion you barely noticed day by day. But then, one quiet afternoon, you caught your reflection in a bucket of still, clean water you were about to use for washing, and the face staring back at you was that of a stranger. You knelt there for a long moment, staring at the wavering image. The face was thin, the cheekbones stark and prominent under a layer of sallow skin. There were dark, purplish circles under your eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to erase. Your eyes themselves, which you remembered as being bright, now seemed larger in your thinned face, and they held a flat, weary expression you didn't recognize. Your lips were oft unchapped and pale. You raised a hand to your hair. It felt dry and brittle, lacking the luster it once had. Malnutrition was stealing its life, just as it was stealing the soft curves from your body. The crimson dress, which had once felt snug, now hung on you, the stiff bard escaping slightly at the top. This physical deterioration was the unspoken reality for the women in your position. While romanticized tales might speak of pirate queens and swashbuckling heroines, the truth for the vast majority of women in these ports was a rapid decline in health and appearance. The combination of poor nutrition, chronic stress, disease, and a lack of basics annotation was a brutal recipe for premature aging. You looked at the other women in the back alley and saw the same story written on their faces. You saw it in the fine lines etched around Mary's eyes, in the gauntness of Isabella's cheeks, in the way their shoulders slumped with a bone-deep fatigue. They were all wilting, like flowers left too long in the sun without water. And Eleanor saw it too. Her sharp, appraising eyes missed nothing. Her business model depended on a supply of fresh, appealing women. As a woman's appearance began to fade, so did her value. Eleanor wouldn't say anything directly, but you would notice subtle shifts. A woman who was looking particularly worn might be given fewer clients, or only the less desirable ones, the meanest drunks, the ones with the least money. It was a quiet, cold emotion. A rather grim but historically supported fact is the short life expectancy of people in these environments. While it's hard to get exact figures for a transient, lawless population like that of Nassau, historians estimate that the life expectancy for a person living in such conditions was incredibly low, perhaps not much beyond 30 or 35 years, for a woman in prostitution, constantly exposed to violence and disease. That number was likely even lower. The Golden Age was, for most of its participants, a very short and brutal affair. You began to understand the desperate, almost frantic way some of the women used their meager earnings. The small bits of rouge, the cheap ribbons, the diluted perfumes bought from a visiting trader. These weren't just vanities. They were tools of the trade, a desperate attempt to paint over the cracks, to mask the decay, to buy themselves a little more time. They were fighting a losing battle against their own reflection. One of the more poignant debates among social historians is about the concept of beauty in past eras. Was the 18th century ideal of female beauty, particularly in a working class or criminal context, the same as ours, while the aristocratic ideal might have favored pale skin and a plump figure as signs of wealth and leisure? In a place like Nassau, the standards might have been different. Perhaps a degree of hardness was valued, or maybe the simple appearance of youth and health, no matter how fleeting, was the most prized commodity of all. The standards were likely as brutal and pragmatic as the economy they served. You stood up from the bucket of water, the image of the stranger rippling and vanishing. You felt a wave of cold panic. Your face, your body, they were your only assets in this place. They were the currency you were forced to trade. And it was a currency that was visibly devaluing with every passing day. That night, you spent a little of your carefully hoarded share of coin to buy a small amount of watered-down gin from one of the other girls. You didn't do it to get drunk, but for the temporary flush it brought to your cheeks, a fleeting imitation of health. As you prepared to go down to the common room, you looked in the cracked mirror, pinching your cheeks and biting your lips to bring some color to them. You saw the stranger again, but this time she was painted, a ghost trying to resemble a living woman. The face in the mirror was a constant, terrifying reminder of your own mortality. Not in the abstract sense of a pirate facing a cannonball, but in a slow, creeping, inexorable way. You were disposable, you were a consumable good, and you were being consumed, day by day, leaving a little less of yourself behind each time. The stranger in the mirror was your future, and she was arriving far, far too quickly. The silent fear that your reflection had sparked in you became a terrifying reality a few weeks later. It happened to Ern, the girl with whom you shared your room, the one with the vacant eyes you had first seen on the tavern steps. Anne was one of the quiet ones. She rarely spoke, moving through the tavern like a phantom, her face a blank canvas on which the men could project whatever they wished. You and she had a ghost-like relationship, two ships passing in the twilight hours of shift changes. You knew her by the indentation she left on the cot, by the scent of her cheap perfume that lingered in the air when you returned upstairs. Lately, however, you had heard her coughing in the night, a deep, wet, persistent cough that seemed to rack her thin frame. During the day, she grew more and more lethargic, her skin taking on a grey, tawny pallor. She had no specific signs of the pox, but it was clear she was sick with something. consumption. They called it then what we now know as tuberculosis. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of Nassau, it spread like wildfire. For a week, Eleanor allowed it, and was still able to work, hiding her coughs and feigning a strength she didn't possess. But her decline was rapid. Soon, she was too weak to even make it down the stairs. She lay on the cot, shivering with fever, the thin blanket pulled up to her chin. You did what you could. You snuck her water and bits of bread from the kitchen. Isabel gave you a herbal concoction that she swore would help with the fever. It was a small, dangerous act of solidarity. Harboring a sick girl was against the unwritten rules of the house. But Eleanor, with her sharp eyes and even sharper business sense, could not be fooled for long. One morning, she came upstairs. She didn't enter the room, just stood in the doorway, her nose wrinkled in distaste at the smell of sickness. She looked at Anne, lying helpless on the cot, and then she looked at you. Her expression was cold, unreadable. Get her things, Eleanor said, her voice flat. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. You stared at her, a knot of ice forming in your stomach. But, where will she go, you whispered, though you already knew the answer. Eleanor's gaze was pitiless. That is no longer my concern. She cannot work. She is a danger to the other girls, and to the clients, to the business. She meant, get her out. No? This was the brutal, unsentimental calculus of survival in the pirate port. A person's worth was measured solely by their ability to generate income. A sick woman was not a patient to be cared for, she was a broken tool to be discarded. There were no hospitals, no charities, no safety nets. The community you felt in the back alley, the fragile bonds of shared misery, could only extend so far. They shattered against the hard wall of economic reality. You slowly gathered Anne's few possessions, a spare shift, a wooden comb with several teeth missing, a small, carved bird that she always kept under her pillow. They barely filled a small bundle. You helped, unto her feet. She was light as a child, her body frail and trembling. She leaned on you heavily as you half carried her down the steep stairs. In the main common room, a few of the other women watched, their faces pale, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and terror. They were all seeing their own potential future. You lead her out the front door and into the harsh glare of the morning sun. The street was already bustling, but people gave you a wide berth, seeing the sickness on Anne's face. You helped her to the side of the street, propping her up against the rough timber wall of the tavern. She looked at you. Her eyes, once vacant, were now clear with a terrifying understanding. Thank you, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. You pressed the bundle of her things into her hands. There was nothing more you could do. You were powerless. To protest further, to try and care for her yourself, would be to risk being cast out alongside her. You turned and walked back into the tavern, the door swinging shut behind you, leaving her alone on the street. You didn't look back. You couldn't bear to. The historical record is almost entirely silent on the fates of these women. They disappear from the ledgers, from the court records, from history itself. What happened to them? Some historians speculate they might have found refuge in the nascent free black communities, known as maroon villages, in the hills of islands like Jamaica. These communities, formed by escaped slaves, were often more welcoming to outcasts. But this is largely conjecture. The more likely and brutal truth is that most of them simply died, quickly and anonymously, in the alleyways and gutters of the very towns that had consumed their lives. The debate over their final days is a testament to how completely they were erased. That night, you lay on the cot that still held the faint warmth of Anne's fevered body. The room felt huge and empty. Her disappearance was not a dramatic event. There was no funeral, no mourning. She was simply gone, erased. It was as if she had never existed. And you knew, with a certainty that chilled you to the bone, that the same thing could happen to you. One day, you would be the one left on the side of the road, and someone else would be walking back into the tavern, trying not to look back. The quiet erasure of Anne was a turning point. Before, there had been a sliver of desperate, illogical hope. A fantasy that if you worked hard enough, if you were clever enough, you could somehow pay off your debt to Eleanor and walk away. Mary's cynical advice to spend your earnings had always been met with a small, secret part of you that rebelled, that insisted on saving. You would drop your tiny share of a coin into the wooden chest at the foot of your bed, and the small, growing weight of the silver was the weight of that hope. After Anne was cast out, that fantasy dissolved like sea mist in the morning sun. You understood the truth. Deep in your bones, the debt was not a number to be paid down. It was a legal fiction, a narrative designed to justify your permanent bondage. One slow afternoon, when Eleanor was out haggling with a merchant, you snuck into her small, stuffy office. Your heart pounded in your chest. If you were caught, the punishment would be severe, but you had to know. You found the heavy ledger on her desk and opened it, your hands trembling as you flipped through the stiff, ink-stained pages until you found your name. There it was, a column of figures that represented your life. On one side, the debts, the initial 70 pieces of 8 for passage and clothing, plus the 2 pieces of 8 added relentlessly each week for your board. The total was already a staggering sum, an impossible mountain of silver. On the other side was the column for your earnings. It was a pitifully small number. You looked at the careful, spittery handwriting, and a cold fury washed over you. The numbers were wrong. You remembered a night when a generous captain had given you 2 coins, but only one was recorded here. You saw deductions. You knew nothing about a charge for a broken glass, another for being late to the common room. The books were cooked. Mary had been right. It wasn't just a system designed to be difficult, it was an actively fraudulent one. Every entry was a lie, every number a nail in the coffin of your freedom. Even if you were to work every single night for years, even if you saved every single fraction of a coin you were allotted, you would never, ever break even. You would die in debt. You closed the ledger, the soft thud of the leather cover sounding like a judge's gavel. The cage wasn't the tavern, or even the island. The cage was this book, a work of fiction that had more power over your life than any truth. This realization, that the system is rigged, is a common theme in the histories of unfree labor, from sharecroppers in the American South trapped by debt to the company store, to indentured servants whose contracts were infinitely extended for minor infractions. The mechanism was the same. The legal and economic structures were designed not for repayment, but for perpetual control. It was a more subtle, and often more effective, form of slavery. You went back upstairs and opened your own small wooden chest. You looked at the little pile of coins you had so carefully saved. They looked pathetic, meaningless, a child's treasure. The hope they represented was a fool's hope. A niche but fascinating area of historical study is the psychology of hopelessness in oppressed populations. What happens when a person realizes that their situation is inescapable? Some historians argue this leads to apathy and resignation, a kind of social death. Others contend that it can be a catalyst for a different kind of resistance, not the hope of escape, but the fight for small dignities, for sabotage, for a refusal to let one's spirit be entirely crushed. The debate centers on what resistance truly means in a context of total powerlessness. You sat on your cot, the full weight of your situation pressing down on you. You were property. Your life was a line item in a fraudulent account book. The gilded cage, which had always seemed at least remotely possible to escape, was now revealed to be a fortress of ink and paper, its walls infinitely high. That evening, when a sailor offered you a drink, you didn't just take a polite sip, you drank it down. When he told a crude joke, you laughed, a sound that was harder and more brittle than before. A part of you had broken, the part that had clung to a future beyond the walls of the tavern. What was left was a cold, hard resolve. If you couldn't escape, you could at least survive. If you couldn't be free, you could at least find a way to endure. The game had changed. It was no longer about winning. It was about not letting them see you lose. You began to understand Mary's philosophy on a much deeper level. The tiny acts of indulgence, buying a ribbon, spending a coin on a piece of fresh fruit, were not frivolous. They were acts of rebellion. They were a way of stealing a moment of pleasure from a life that was supposed to be nothing but service and misery. It was a way of declaring that, even if your labor and your body belonged to Eleanor's ledger, a small, secret part of your experience was still your own. The discovery in the ledger didn't crush you completely. It burned away the illusions, leaving behind a cold, clear, and terrifying reality. Your gilded cage had no door. It never heard, and now you knew you had to find a way to live within it, without letting it destroy you completely. The specter of the pox was a constant, terrifying backdrop to your life, but it was an abstract fear until you saw the cure. One of the older pirates, a man named Silas who had been a regular at the tavern for years, began to show the unmistakable signs. It started with a tremor in his hands and a certain wildness in his eyes. Then came the slurred speech and the memory lapses. It was the tertiary stage of syphilis, attacking his nervous system. Most men in his condition would have been left to their fate. But Silas was a quartermaster, a man of some standing, and he still had a small fortune in silver stashed away. He was not willing to fade into madness and death without a fight. He decided to seek treatment. The only person on the island who called himself a doctor was a disgraced naval surgeon named Finch. He had been dismissed from the Royal Navy for drunkenness and malpractice, and had washed up in Nassau like so much other human debris. He set up a small clinic in a shack near the docks, offering his dubious services to anyone who could pay. Silas, desperate, paid him handsomely. You and some of the other women watched from a distance as Finch began his famous salivation treatment. This was the pinnacle of 17th and 18th century medicine for syphilis, and it was a horror show. The primary ingredient was mercury. Finch would administer the mercury in several ways. Sometimes it was an ointment, rubbed vigorously into the skin. Sometimes it was a pill, to be swallowed. Most horrifilously, it could be vaporized over a fire, with the patient forced to inhale the toxic fumes. The goal of the treatment was to induce massive, uncontrolled drooling, or salivation, the medical theory of the time, based on the ancient idea of bodily humors, was that the disease was a poison that could be expelled from the body through its fluids. If a patient produced pints of saliva, it was considered a sign that the treatment was working, that the syphilitic poison was being driven out. You saw Silas after his first few treatments. He was a wreck. He sat shivering in a chair, a bucket by his side, his mouth in a constant, grotesque drool he couldn't control. His gums were swollen and bleeding, and his breath was foul. This was a classic sign of severe mercury poisoning. The cure, in essence, was a form of controlled poisoning. The doctors of the day knew mercury was toxic, but they believed they could administer just enough to kill the disease without killing the patient. It was a terrifyingly fine line, and they frequently got it wrong. The side effects were horrendous: severe dental problems, including teeth falling out, kidney and liver damage, and severe neurological damage, leading to tremors known as hatter's shakes. As hat makers used mercury in their trade, memory loss, and psychosis. One of the strangest and most ghoulish facts about this treatment is the existence of mercury-gilded skulls that have been found by archaeologists. In some severe cases of long-term mercury treatment, the toxic metal would actually be deposited on the bones of the sufferer. Skulls have been unearthed from 18th century graves with a noticeable metallic, silvery sheen on their surface, a permanent, silent testament to the horrific cure the person endured. You watched Silas deteriorate over the course of a few weeks. The man who walked into Drive Finch's shack was a robust, if ailing, pirate. The man who emerged was a shaking, trolling, incoherent shell. The mercury was destroying his mind and body far more quickly than the syphilis had been. He lost his teeth. His hair began to fall out. His formidable presence evaporated, replaced by the twitching, vacant stare of a man who was no longer there. The historical debate among medical historians is whether the mercury treatment had any positive effect at all. Some modern analysis suggests that mercury does have some mild spirochetecidal properties. It can kill the bacteria that causes syphilis. So it's possible that, in some rare cases, it might have arrested the disease's progression, at a terrible cost. However, the vast majority of scholars agree that the treatment was, in most cases, far more dangerous and deadly than the disease it was meant to cure. Patients who survived the cure were often left with permanent, debilitating health problems. One afternoon, Cyrus, in a moment of mercury-induced delirium, stumbled out of the clinic and fell into the harbor. No one made a move to save him. He was seen as a dead man walking, a ghost already claimed by his own cure. His body washed up on the beach a few days later. Dr. Finch, unperturbed, simply nailed a notice to his door advertising his successful, if unfortunately concluded, treatment to the late Silas. He had, after all, been paid in advance. Seeing what happened to Silas changed your fear of the pox. It was no longer just a fear of the disease itself, of the sores, the decay, the madness. It was now a double-sided terror. To get the disease was a death sentence. To seek the cure was to choose a different, but equally horrific, path to the grave. There was no good option. There was no hope of intervention. You were utterly at the mercy of biology and the brutal ignorance of the age. The sight of Dr. Finch's shack became a more potent symbol of death than a pirate's flag. It represented the terrifying truth that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those who claim to be trying to save you. The ground beneath your feet in Nassau always felt temporary, a thin crust of mud and sand over the vast, indifferent sea. This feeling was amplified by the stories you heard, whispered in the tavern during quiet night stories about Port Royal. Port Royal, on the coast of Jamaica, had been the original pirate paradise, the first and greatest of the lawless havens. For decades in the latter half of the 17th century, it was known as the richest and wickedest city in the world. It was the Nassau of its day, but bigger, wealthier, and even more debauched. It was the headquarters for the legendary buccaneers like Henry Morgan, a place where stolen Spanish gold flowed like water, and the taverns were said to be more numerous than the houses. The older pirates, the ones who had been sailing these waters for decades, spoke of it with a kind of awe. They described streets paved with cobblestone, multi-story brick buildings, and storehouses groaning with silks, spices, and silver. It was a city built entirely on plunder, a monument to greed and excess. And then, in a single morning, it was gone. On June 7, Yarujoa, a massive earthquake struck Jamaica. This wasn't just a tremor, it was a cataclysm. The ground liquefied. The sandy peninsula on which Port Royal was built gave way, and in a matter of minutes, 2/3 of the city, along with its fabulous wealth and thousands of its inhabitants, slid directly into the sea. Eyewitness accounts from the time are apocalyptic. They described the ground opening up and swallowing people whole, of buildings collapsing into dust, and of a massive tsunami that washed over what was left of the city, carrying ships from the harbor and depositing them in the middle of the ruined streets. For the deeply religious and superstitious people of the 17th century, there was only one possible explanation for such an event. It was divine retribution. It was God himself, striking down the modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah with a righteous fury. Preachers and pamphleteers across the world seized upon the story as a cautionary tale, a stark warning against a life of sin and piracy. This narrative became a powerful piece of folklore throughout the Caribbean. For the pirates in your tavern, the story of Port Royal was a ghost story, a legend that haunted them. It was a reminder that even the greatest pirate stronghold, the most impregnable fortress of sin, was ultimately built on sand. It fed their fatalism, their eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die philosophy. If a whole city could be wiped from the face of the earth in an instant, what hope did a single man or a single ship have? For you, the story had a different, more unsettling meaning. As you stood in the mud of Nassau, A town of flimsy wooden shacks and makeshift structures. You couldn't help but feel the profound instability of it all. This place, which felt like the entire world, was just a temporary collection of wooden desperation on a fragile slip of land. The very ground you stood on felt untrustworthy. A fascinating cold case for marine archaeologists is the ongoing excavation of the sunken city of Port Royal. It is one of the most important underwater archaeological sites in the world, a Pompeii of the New World. Because the city sank so quickly, it was preserved almost perfectly in the silt of the harbor. Excavations have brought up thousands of perfectly preserved 17th century artifacts, pewter plates, clay pipes, and young bottles still full of wine, and even entire building foundations. One of the most famous finds is a pocket watch, stopped at 11:43 a.m., believed to be the exact moment the earthquake struck. These finds provide an unparalleled, frozen-in-time snapshot of everyday life in a pirate city. The debate among historians and geologists is whether the pirates themselves contributed to the disaster. Was it simply an act of God, a random tectonic event, or did the rapid, poorly planned construction of heavy brick buildings on unstable, reclaimed land exacerbate the effects of the earthquake? Some argue that the pirates' own hubris and greed, their desire to build a great city on a foundation of sand, made the catastrophic collapse inevitable. It's a debate about whether the disaster was purely natural or partly man-made, a result of the very same recklessness that defined the pirate ethos. The story of Port Royal made you see Nassau differently. It wasn't a permanent place. It was a temporary camp, a fleeting moment of chaos that could be washed away by the next hurricane or swallowed by the sea. The men who swaggered to the tavern, who seemed so powerful and indestructible, were just ghosts in the making. Their stories destined to be silenced by a wave or a tremor. This feeling of unreality, of living on borrowed time in a place that shouldn't exist, was unsettling, but in a strange way, it was also liberating. If everything was temporary, if the entire city could vanish tomorrow, then perhaps the seemingly permanent structures of your own life, Eleanor's ledger, your debt, your servitude were not so permanent after all. It didn't offer a practical path to freedom, but it offered a philosophical one. It was a reminder that the world was far bigger and more chaotic than the tiny, oppressive confines of the tavern. The tale of Port Royal was more than a ghost story. It was a reminder of the awesome, terrifying power of the natural world, a power that dwarfed the petty cruelties of men. It made you feel both incredibly small and, paradoxically, part of something vast and epic. You were a tiny figure in a grand, tragic story, living in a city that was just a footnote in a future ghost story, waiting to be told. Your reflection in the water bucket had been a prophecy, and it was slowly coming true. The physical toll of your life in Nassau was becoming undeniable, and with it came a subtle but significant shift in your status within the tavern's brutal hierarchy. You were moved from the spotlight to the shadows. It wasn't a formal demotion. There was no announcement, no official change in your duties. It was a gradual, creeping marginalization. You noticed it first when a new batch of girls arrived, brought in on a trading sloop from one of the more settled islands. They were young, fresh-faced, their eyes still wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, naive hope. They were given the new dresses, the ones with the brightest colors and the fanciest, cheapest lace. You were left with your more faded crimson gown, now patched in several places. When a wealthy pirate captain and his officers came ashore, it was the new girls who were pushed forward by Eleanor, presented as the prime offerings. You and the other women who had been there for a while were directed towards the common sailors, the men with less silver in their pockets and more cruelty in their drink. Then, you were moved out of your room. One of the new girls, a young woman named Sarah, was assigned to the cot you had shared with the ghost of Anne. You were moved to a smaller, even more wretched space, a windowless alcove at the end of the hall, barely large enough for a thin straw mattress on the floor. You shared this space with Isabel, the older French woman, who had long ago been relegated to the tavern's periphery. Your new home was in the darkest, most forgotten corner of the building. It was here that the women who were fading were sent. You were no longer prime real estate. You were now in the bargain bin. This process of aging out was swift and ruthless. A woman's peak earning potential in this trade was terrifyingly short. In a matter of a year or two, she could go from being a prized commodity to being old news. Her value diminished by familiarity, by the physical signs of her harsh life, and by the constant influx of new, younger competition. Erno's business model, like the pirate economy itself, was based on novelty and plunder, and you were no longer novel. You now spent more of your nights working not in the main common room, but as a simple barmaid, hauling tankards of rum and cleaning up spills. The direct transactions with men became less frequent. This might have seemed like a relief, but it was also an economic death sentence. Your already pitiful earnings dwindled to almost nothing. The chances of ever making a dent in your fraudulent debt, which had been impossible before, were now a laughable fiction. The historical study of prostitution often highlights this brutal age-based stratification. In almost every era and culture, youth has been the most valuable attribute, and the economic and social marginalization of aging prostitutes is a near-universal theme. What makes the pirate port context so extreme is the speed of the process. In a stable, urban environment, a woman might be able to transition into other roles, becoming a madam herself, or a seamstress, or a fishwife. In the chaotic, transient world of Nassau, there were few such safety nets. The fall from grace was swift and the landing was hard. Isabel, your new roommate, understood this better than anyone. She had been in Nassau for almost a decade, a true survivor. She had seen generations of girls come and go. She accepted her place in the tavern shadows with a resigned, weary grace. "We are like the ship's figurehead," she told you one night, her voice a dry whisper in the dark. "At first, we are new and brightly painted, leading the way, but the sun and the salt and the sea take their toll. The paint flakes, the wood cracks. We are still on the ship, but no one looks at us anymore. We are just there, part of the woodwork." A curious undebated aspect of this aging out process is whether these older, marginalized women formed a kind of shadow council within the tavern's female community. Did their experience and survival skills give them a different kind of status? One not based on youth, but on wisdom. Did they become the keepers of the community's oral history? The ones who warned the new girls, who knew the best herbal remedies, who understood the complex social dynamics of the port. Some feminist historians argue for this interpretation, suggesting that these women found a new kind of power in their marginalization. Others argue that this is a romantic notion, and that in such a brutal, competitive environment, they were more likely seen simply as cautionary tales. You found yourself in a strange limbo. You were no longer the primary object of the men's attention, which brought a small measure of relief from the constant threat of violence and disease. But this invisibility also brought a new kind of despair. You were becoming a ghost while you were still alive. Your presence was becoming less and less significant. You were fading into the grimy, smoky background of the tavern, just another piece of worn-out furniture. The fear of being cast out like and was replaced by a different fear, the fear of being forgotten, of slowly disappearing in plain sight. Until one day, there was nothing left of you at all. In the quiet, shadowy corner of the tavern that was now your world, with the roar of the common room a distant, muffled beast, your mind began to drift. The present was a monotonous cycle of small chores and long, empty hours. The future was a blank wall, so your thoughts turned, unbidden, to the past. It was a place you had tried very hard not to go. The memories were locked away in a dark room in your mind, the door firmly shut. But now, in the stillness, the lock began to rust, and the door creaked open. You would lie on your straw mattress in the dark, next to the soft, steady breathing of Isabel, and fragments of another life would flicker behind your eyes. A life before the ship, before the salt and the fear, before the crimson dress. You remembered a field. The memory was hazy, like a dream upon waking. But it was there, a field of green, under a pale, watery sun that was nothing like the relentless, brutal sun of the Caribbean. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and hay. You remembered the rough, comforting texture of a wool blanket and the taste of fresh milk, warmed from the cow. Was it real, or was it a story you were telling yourself? Then, a different memory, sharper and more painful. A crowded, stinking street in a city. Bristol, maybe, or London, the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones. The constant shouting of street vendors. The smell of coal smoke and driven mud. You remembered a small, cramped room with too many people. The gnawing ache of hunger, a constant presence. You remembered the promise of a new life, a new world, spoken by a man with kind eyes and a persuasive smile. A promise of work in a grand house in the Americas, of good wages and a fresh start. This was the story of so many who ended up in the New World in the 17th and 18th centuries. They were not all wealthy adventurers or religious dissenters. A huge number were the poor, the desperate, the dispossessed of Europe, lured by the promises of recruiters for indentured servitude. They would sign a contract, trading several years of their labor for passage across the Atlantic. It was a gamble, a desperate bet on a better future. But the reality was often a brutal bait and switch. The grand house could turn out to be a shack on a tobacco plantation. The good wages were often non-existent, swallowed by the cost of their upkeep, much like your debt to Eleanor. And the contract itself was a piece of property, one that could be sold and traded. A young woman who signed on to be a lady's maid in Virginia could easily find her contract sold to a tavern owner in Jamaica or Nassau. Her fate sealed before she even set foot on dry land. You remembered the ship, the suffocating darkness of the lower decks, the constant rocking motion that made your stomach churn, the stench of unwashed bodies, seasickness, and despair. You remembered the man with the kind eyes turning cold and indifferent once you were at sea. You were no longer a potential worker, you were cargo. The historical debate surrounding indentured servitude is a fierce one. Was it a legitimate, if harsh, system of labor migration, offering a ladder of opportunity for the poor, or was it simply a form of temporary slavery? A brutal system of exploitation that was often as deadly and inescapable as chattel slavery for many women. The distinction would have been purely academic. The loss of autonomy, the vulnerability to abuse, and the back-breaking labor were their daily reality, regardless of the legal terminology. One memory, sharp and clear as glass, surfaced in a feverish doze one afternoon. You were standing on the deck of the ship as it pulled into a harbor. You saw the turquoise water, the white sand, the riot of green jungle. You felt a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. This was it, the new world, a new beginning. Then you saw the man who was waiting on the dock. Not a gentleman in a fine coat, but a rough, weather-beaten man with a pistol in his belt. The man who had bought your contract. The man who led down the muddy track to the tavern, to Eleanor, to this life. The memory of that hope, so bright and so brief, was the most painful memory of all. It was the memory of the exact moment your future was stolen from you. These flashes of the past were not comforting. They were agonizing. They reminded you that you had not always been this person. This ghost in the corner of a pirate tavern. You had been someone else. You had had a name that was your own, a family, a home. You had had a future, however humble, that had not involved this. The question that haunts historians studying the lives of anonymous women like you is one of identity. How did they reconcile the person they were with the person they were with the person they were forced to become? Did they cling to the memory of their past life as a source of strength, a secret self that could not be touched, or did they try to forget, to kill the memory of the person they once were in order to survive the present? We can find no diaries, no letters. We only have the cold, external facts of their existence. The internal journey, the battle for a sense of self, is lost to history. Lying there in the dark, you felt like to people, the girl from the green field, and the woman on the straw mattress. They were separated by an ocean of trauma and time, and you knew, with a deep and profound sadness, that you could never go back. The door to that past was not just locked, it had vanished completely. The memories were just ghosts, taunting you with a life you could no longer claim as your own. The line between the living and the dead was perilously thin in Nassau. You saw it in the casual violence of the tavern, in the slow decay of disease, in the vacant stare of a man lost to a mercury cure. But it was a trip to the edge of the settlement that made the finality of it all starkly, brutally clear. Isabel had fallen ill, not with the pox or consumption, but with a recurring fever that left her weak and trembling, a common ailment in the tropics that they called the ague, likely malaria, carried by the ever-present mosquitoes. She needed quinine, a bitter powder made from the bark of the cinchona tree, which was known to be an effective treatment. It was expensive, available only from the apothecary, a man as greedy as Drive, Finch. You and a few of the other faded women pooled your tiny, hoarded resources. It was a desperate, foolish act of loyalty, spending your precious coins not on a ribbon or extra food, but on a chance to save one of your own. You bought the quinine, and for a few days, Isabel seemed to rally, but she was too old, too worn down by years of hardship. The fever returned, and one morning, you woke to find her still and cold beside you on the straw mattress. Eleanor's reaction was one of pure, pragmatic annoyance. A death in the tavern was bad for business and a logistical problem. Take her out, Bert, she ordered, her voice sharp. Deal with it. There was no undertaker, no priest, no ceremony. The task fell to you, to Mary, and to one of the tavern's handymen, a silent, grim man named Jacob. You wrapped Isabel's frail body in her own thin blanket. It was a pathetic shroud. Jacob built a crude box from old, splintered planks of wood. It was barely a coffin. He threw the box onto a handcart, and the three of you began the slow, grim procession out of the town. You pushed the rattling cart through the muddy streets, past the indifferent stares of pirates and merchants. A death was not an unusual sight here. It was just part of the scenery. You left the main settlement behind, following a narrow, overgrown path towards a small, sandy clearing on a windswept bluff overlooking the sea. This was the burial ground. It wasn't a proper cemetery with neat rows of headstones. It was a potter's field, a dumping ground for the nameless, the indigent, the forgotten. The ground was lumpy and uneven, marked only by a few crude wooden crosses, most of them leaning or fallen over, slowly being reclaimed by the scrubby vegetation. This was the final destination for the vast majority of people who died in a pirate port. While a wealthy captain might be buried with some ceremony, the common sailor, the indentured servant, and especially the women of the taverns, were given no such dignity. They were interred in shallow, unmarked graves, their existence erased from the landscape as thoroughly as it was from the historical record. Jacob had already dug a shallow trench in the sandy soil. It didn't look deep enough. He grunted with effort as he and Mary lowered the crude box into the hole. The sound of it hitting the bottom was a dull, hollow thud. You stood there, the salty wind whipping strands of hair across your face. You looked out at the turquoise sea, so beautiful and so indifferent. This was it. This was the end of Isabel's long, hard journey, from a flower-filled home in the French islands to this desolate patch of sand. All her stories, all her kindness, all her suffering, reduced to a box in a shallow hole. One of the great challenges for archaeologists is locating and identifying sites like this. Because the graves were unmarked and often shallow, they are incredibly difficult to find. Bioarchaeologists who have excavated similar 18th century potters' fields have found skeletons bearing the marks of a brutal life, healed fractures from violent bone lesions from diseases like syphilis and tuberculosis, and severe dental decay from malnutrition. These skeletons tell a silent story of the hardship endured by the forgotten people of the past. The debate often revolves around the identity of these remains, Can we ever truly know if this was a sailor, a servant, or a prostitute? They are often just anonymous victims of a harsh era. Jacob began to shovel the sandy earth back into the hole. The sound of the dirt hitting the wooden box was the most final sound you had ever heard. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut forever. When he was done, there was just a mound of freshly turned earth. There was no marker. In a few weeks, after a few heavy rains, the mound would settle. In a few months, the weeds would grow over it. It would be as if it had never been there, as if Isabel had never existed. You looked around at the other anonymous mounds. This one could be Anne, that one could be Elodie, and one day, one of them would be yours. This was the only certain future this place offered. Not a return home, not a life of freedom, but a shallow, unmarked grave on a windswept bluff, your memory left to the mercy of the wind and the weeds. The pirates might dream of treasure chests buried in the sand, but this, you realized, was the only treasure this island held for you, a small plot of anonymous earth. You walked back from the burial ground in a daze, the sound of the wind and the sea still ringing in your ears. The tavern, when you returned, felt different. It was just the empty space where Isabel used to be. A new energy was crackling in the air. An excitement you hadn't felt in weeks. You saw it in Eleanor's sharp, focused expression, in the way the other women were bustling about, a nervous energy in their movements. You found Mary in the back alley, scrubbing a pot with a vigor that bordered on frantic. "What is it?" you asked. She didn't look up from her work. A ship was sighted, a big one, the Queen's Revenge. Her voice was a mixture of dread and anticipation. "Black boats grew. They say they've taken a Spanish treasure fleet." Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts. The name was a legend in the Caribbean. Even among legends, he was one of the most successful and most feared pirates of the Golden Age. In a career that lasted only a few years, he had captured over 400 ships. His crews were known for their discipline at sea and their absolute abandon on shore. Their arrival meant one thing: a tidal wave of gold and silver was about to crash upon Nassau. The port, which had been languishing in a long, quiet lull, sprang to life. Merchant sun boarded their windows. The blacksmiths forged roared. It was as if the town itself was taking a deep breath, preparing for the coming storm. For you, the news was met with a profound and weary numbness. A few months ago, the arrival of such a ship would have filled you with a familiar mix of fear and professional anxiety. Now, it felt distant, like a storm happening in another country. You knew what it meant: a deluge of loud, drunken men, nights of endless work, and a brief respite from the gnawing hunger of the lean times. But the core of you, the part that felt and feared, seemed to have been hollowed out. Later that afternoon, the Queen's Revenge sailed majestically into the harbor, its black flag with the iconic skull and crossed cutlasses snapping in the breeze. The town seemed to hold its breath. Then, the first longboats filled with pirates hit the beach, and the roar began. You watched from the tavern doorway as they stormed up the street, their pockets heavy with plunder. They were loud, arrogant, and radiated an aura of dangerous invincibility. And then you saw it, at the back of the first group of pirates, being herded along like livestock, was a small group of women. They were pale, terrified, their fine dresses torn and stained from travel. They were captives from a wealthy merchant ship, part of the pirates' plunder, just like the bolts of silken chests of silver. A new shipment had arrived. Eleanor was already at the door, a predatory gleam in her eye. She conferred with one of Black Bart's officers, her gestures sharp and businesslike. A deal was struck. Coins exchanged hands. The captured women, dazed and weeping, were shoved into the tavern. You saw one of them, a girl no older than 16, with wide, terrified blue eyes. She looked at you, her expression a silent plea for help, for answers. You saw yourself in her. You saw the girl who had stepped off the ship all that time ago, full of a hope that had been so quickly extinguished. Eleanor barked orders. The new girls were to be clean, dressed, and prepared. They were the main attraction now. Their arrival rendered you and the other veterans almost completely invisible. You were now just part of the scenery, the background noise to their tragedy. This was the brutal, cyclical nature of this world. It was a machine that constantly required fresh fuel. The women were a disposable commodity, used up and cast aside, always replaced by a new, fresh supply. Your own story, which felt so singular and so painful, was just one turn of a wheel that had been turning long before you arrived and would continue to turn long after you were gone. The historical reality of female captives is a dark and often intentionally obscured part of the pirate story. While some women were passengers on captured ships and were eventually ransomed or released, many others, particularly those without powerful families, simply vanished. Their fates were rarely recorded. They were absorbed into the brutal economy of places like Nassau, their identities erased, their stories lost. The academic debate here is a stark one. Is it better to speculate on their fates based on the grim logic of the time, or to respect the silence of the historical record, acknowledging that we simply cannot know what happened to them? That night, the tavern was a scene of pure bacchanalia. Black Bart's crew spent their money with a reckless abandon that was breathtaking to behold. The new girls, their faces painted into masks of cheerfulness, were paraded before them. You worked at the edge of the chaos, clearing empty tankards, invisible. You watched the young girl with the blue eyes being led up the stairs by a burly, laughing pirate. Her face was a mask of pure, dumb horror. You knew exactly where she was going. You knew exactly what she was feeling. You looked around the roaring, crowded room. It was all happening again. The same story, with a new set of characters. You were no longer the main character of your own tragedy. You were now just a spectator at someone else's. Your existence had become a footnote, a prelude to the suffering of the next girl in line, and the ship that had brought her would one day be replaced by another, and another. In an endless, brutal cycle, nothing changed. The machine just kept running. Weeks turned into months. The crew of the Queen's Revenge eventually sailed away, leaving behind a depleted town and a handful of new ghosts. The cycle began again, the lean times, the quiet desperation, the anxious waiting. The new girls, including the one with the blue eyes whose name you learned was Lydia, slowly shed their initial terror, replacing it with the same hard, brittle shell that you and the others wore. The wheel kept turning. Your own existence faded further into the background. You were now permanently relegated to the kitchen and the scullery. Your nights spent washing tankards and scrubbing floors, your face rarely seen in the common room. You were one of the old ones, a permanent fixture, as much a part of the tavern as the soot-stained beams and the perpetually sticky floor. Your debt to Eleanor was a forgotten joke, a number so absurdly large that even she no longer bothered to mention it. You were hers for life, and your life's value was now measured in how many plates you could wash before collapsing from exhaustion. Your story, you realized, was ending not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet fade to grey. There would be no dramatic escape, no climactic confrontation. There would only be this, the endless repetition of mundane, grueling tasks, until one day, like Isabel, you simply stopped. And in the grand sweep of history, your story, your suffering, your entire existence would be reduced to a footnote. If that, the Golden Age of Piracy would be remembered for its flamboyant captains, its epic sea battles, and its buried treasure. It would be romanticized, sanitized, turned into children's stories and blockbuster films. The swaggering men who had used and discarded you would become folk heroes. But you and Marion, Isabel and Undelity and Lydia, and the thousands of other women whose names we will never know, you would be invisible. Your lives would be a silent scream, unheard beneath the roar of the cannons and the cheerful singing of sea shanties. The only place your name might survive is in the cold, impersonal scratch of a pen in a ledger. By name, Eleanor's girl, listed next to a debt, or perhaps in a court deposition. a witness to a brawl, identified only as a woman from the tavern. Most likely, not at all. You would be utterly and completely erased. The academic field of history from below has spent the last few decades trying to recover the stories of people like you. Historians sift through court records, parish registers, shipping manifests, and account books, searching for the faint traces of the illiterate, the poor, and the marginalized. They try to piece together the lives of those who left no diaries or letters, but the task is monumental. And the sources are frustratingly silent on the very things we want to know most. What did they feel? What did they hope for? Who did they love? The debate among these historians is a profound one. How much can we truly claim to know about the inner lives of people who left no records of their own? Is it academically sound to use informed imagination to fill in the gaps, to try and reconstruct their emotional world, or does that risk imposing our own modern sensibilities onto the past? It's a debate about the very limits of history, about what we can know versus what we can only sorrowfully guess at. Your life was a testament to that silence. You lived and suffered and survived in a world that did not value your voice, and so your voice was never recorded. You were the human cost of the pirate's freedom. You were the dark, ugly truth beneath the romantic myth. Your unmarked grave on the windswept bluff would be the final, silent punctuation mark on a story that was never written. And as you stand there, in the dim light of the scullery, your hands rough from the harsh soap and hot water, you look at your own reflection in a bucket of murky water. You see the stranger again, the old, tired woman with the hollow eyes, but you are no longer frightened of her. You are her. Your name is a whisper, a ghost, a footnote in a history that has forgotten you ever even existed. The noise of the tavern begins to fade, a low hum that recedes into the background of your thoughts. The sharp smell of rum and smoke softens, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic sound of the waves on the shore, a sound that has become the lullaby of your long, strange dream. The flickering candlelight in your mind dims, the harsh edges of the world softening into a gentle, blurry peace. You can feel the straw mattress beneath you, but it is no longer scratchy and uncomfortable. It is soft, like a cloud, cradling you as you drift. The weight of the day, the weight of a lifetime of sorrows, begins to lift from your shoulders. The faces of the men, the cold gaze of Eleanor, the ghost of Isabel, they all dissolve, becoming indistinct shapes in the gathering twilight of your mind. You are floating now, in a warm, quiet space between waking and sleeping. The cool, damp earth of that long-forgotten field is beneath you. The pale, gentle sun is on your face. There is no death here. There is no fear. There is only a profound and welcome stillness. The story is over. The struggle is done. All that is left is this gentle, easy drift into the soft, deep quiet of the night. Let the waves carry you now, into the peaceful harbor of your dreams. The end of the article. Good night.